Today's episode is a fan favorite. The audio in the story has been remastered for today's episode. On a morning in May of 2014, a detective sat next to the hospital bed of a mortally injured 77-year-old woman. This woman had been in a coma for the last 10 days following a vicious attack on her. And in that time, the detective had been desperately working to try to figure out who had attacked her. But now, somewhat amazingly, the woman had woken up from her coma, and now this detective was finally getting the chance to ask the victim directly, who did this to you? However, when the woman began to speak, this conversation would not go as planned. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do. So if that's of interest to you, please take the follow button out for a beach day, but secretly replace their sunscreen with cooking oil. Okay, let's get into today's story. Late in the afternoon on May 6th, 2014, 77-year-old Helene Pastor sat at her office desk in Monaco with a phone pressed to her ear. And on the other end was one of Helene's many tenants, doing what they did best, which was to complain. This time there was a problem with their water heater, and apparently the plumber was late. And Helene, like she always did, listened patiently, because she was a landlord, and this was her job. But when this tenant was finished, Helene told them in a soft but firm voice that the plumber would be there eventually, and that they, the tenant, were certainly not too important to wait. Then she hung up. Helene knew her tenant wouldn't like this, but she also just didn't have patience for entitled, wealthy snobs. Unfortunately for her, though, she spent a lot of time with people like that, because Helene was actually the single richest woman in all of Monaco. So Monaco is a country located on the Mediterranean coast, and it's surrounded on three sides by France. And so Monaco and France share a lot of cultural similarities. But unlike France, Monaco is very, very small, just under a mile wide, and has only about 39,000 citizens. And many of those 39,000 citizens are incredibly wealthy. It's essentially a country of millionaires and billionaires living in ultra-luxury condos and high-rises all along its coastline. And Helene and her family, the Pastors, owned most of those condos, which meant they were among the wealthiest landlords not just in Monaco, but on the whole planet. The Pastors' multi-billion-dollar real estate empire had started 3 generations ago, and Helene was now in charge of it. It was a lot of work, and Helene could have passed it off to somebody else. But she was a Pastor, and Pastors worked for what they had. Which was why, despite her wealth, Helene was a very hands-on landlord and spent long days in her office with her staff, dealing with accounting and handling tenants' requests and complaints, like about, the plumber not being on time. Now, Helene picked up the phone once more to make one more call before she left for the day, and this call was to her daughter, Sylvia. Sylvia was 53 and had been diagnosed with breast cancer 2 years earlier, so Helene, naturally worried about her a lot and checked in with her daily. And on this day, when she heard her daughter pick up and say hello, Helene immediately asked her, how are you feeling? But Sylvia said she actually couldn't talk right now. Her massage therapist had just arrived, and so she excused herself and hung up. Helene took the phone off her ear and just stared at the receiver as the dial tone blared through it, doing her best not to feel hurt. Helene knew she was a very demanding parent and, generally was not particularly warm, but she loved Sylvia. And lately, it seemed like her daughter just didn't necessarily reciprocate that. And Helene knew exactly who to blame for this. And it was not Sylvia, and it wasn't even Helene. It was Sylvia's boyfriend, Wojciech. Now, Sylvia had been with Wojciech for almost 3 decades, and it seemed like everyone in Monaco absolutely loved this guy. I mean, he was charming and gregarious and gave a ton of money to charity. But Helene had always felt like there was just something off about him. And she worried that he was taking advantage of her daughter's very famous name. And so generally, there had just been this sort of sitting, unspoken tension between Helene and Sylvia about Wojciech. The fact that clearly Helene didn't really like him. Like, that tension was there between the mother and daughter. But lately, it seemed like that tension had finally gotten to the point where, Helene and Sylvia were just having all these little arguments that, sometimes were actually about Wojciech, and other times were about completely different things. It was like they were just quick to argue with each other. But for now, Helene looked at the time and saw, it was time to go. And so she stood up and she smoothed out her beautiful Chanel suit. And she knew that if she wanted to see her son Gildo tonight, she really needed to get a move on here. So Gildo, Helene's son, had been in the hospital for the last few months after having a stroke. Helene visited with him daily, making the 45-minute drive from Monaco to where he was hospitalized in Nice, France. Now, the daily commute was definitely a lot, but Helene didn't care. She always worked it into her very busy schedule. Now, Gildo was 47, but he was still very much Helene's child. And the whole ordeal had been just awful and very emotional for Helene, especially on top of, her daughter's cancer diagnosis and the tension between her and her daughter. Like, right now, life was pretty tough. Seeing her children like this had reminded Helene that money just could not save you from everything, even in Monaco. Now, Helene grabbed her Hermes purse and she headed out the door. Minutes later, Helene was outside and was climbing into a black minivan that was waiting for her at the curb. And as Helene slid into the back seat, she was greeted by her 64-year-old driver, Mohammed Darwich. So Mohammed had actually been working with Helene now for 15 years. And so the two of them spent the entire 45-minute drive to Nice just chatting about their kids, because in some ways they were, longtime friends. Mohammed told Helene about how he really missed his daughter, who lived back in Egypt with her mom. And he also updated Helene on his son, Wissam, and how he liked living in France. Their conversation made the drive go fast, and before Helene knew it, they were at the hospital. Around 6 p.m. that night, Helene was sitting at Gildo's bedside, helping him drink a glass of water. Like his mother, Gildo had been both blessed and cursed with the pastoral work ethic. Despite the family money, he was constantly starting ventures and investing in businesses. So Helene knew the hospitalization had been really hard for him, not just physically, but just from a work perspective. He was missing out on so many opportunities because he was stuck here. And even though now he was awake and alert, he was still partially paralyzed and just couldn't speak very well. Helene sat with Gildo for about an hour, talking to him and also checking in with his doctors. And then at some point, she kissed her son's forehead and told him she would see him soon. Just after 7 p.m., Helene walked out of the hospital to where Mohammed was waiting in the minivan. And this time, she got into the front passenger seat. And Mohammed, he started the car and they began to make their way out of the lot toward the busy streets of Nice. And pretty much right away, they got stuck in absolutely standstill traffic. And so Helene just sat back in her seat and tried to relax. But as she was doing that, something caught her eye outside of the car, like out her window. It was this person who had a hat kind of pulled down low over their eyes, and they were jogging right towards the minivan. And Helene, she just stared at this person and tried to see if they maybe knew them, because it did seem like they were coming right towards this car, like their car. But then she saw what this person was holding. And immediately she screamed at Mohammed to drive. But before Mohammed could react, Helene heard a loud bang and the sound of shattering glass. About 15 minutes later, the commissioner of the Nice police, Philippe Frison, pulled up to the hospital with the sirens on. He'd been in his office, about to finish up for the day, when he got a call about shots being fired, but he really didn't know how serious it was. So he parked and jumped out of his car, and the first thing he saw was a crowd of people gathered on the street across from the hospital. And they were all staring at this parked black minivan with Monaco plates and also a shattered passenger side window. Frison jogged over, and he was technically the first officer on the scene, but a firefighter standing by the minivan told him a few details based on what he'd seen and what the onlookers had been saying. Apparently, a man dressed in black had come out of nowhere on foot and fired 2 shots into the minivan, striking both the man and the woman who were in there in the head. The shooter had then disappeared back into the crowd, and witnesses saw a second man dressed in black follow after him. The firefighter said that both victims had been taken to the hospital in critical condition, but he didn't know, if they were still alive now, and he also didn't have any information on their identities, just that it was a man and a woman. Immediately, Frison's mind went to carjacking. Now, Nice did not have a huge amount of crime, but one of its more common issues was something called the car door grab, which was when criminals would target cars who were stuck in traffic, and they would rob these cars. And so he wondered if maybe carjackers had approached this vehicle and attempted to rob it. Something happened, they drew a weapon, and then obviously the victims inside were shot, and then the carjackers took off. And so Frison radioed back to the station for backup. A crime like this, whether it was carjacking or not, obviously what he's dealing with here is murder. A crime like this needed more officers than just him. And so he gets in touch with the dispatcher and he fills her in on the need for backup. And then during this discussion, she actually passes one more piece of information to Frison that she had recently learned. And that was the identities of the victims. And the reason that they already knew who these people were is because one of the victims was incredibly famous. The woman who had been shot was Helene Pastor. The other victim was her driver, Mohammed Darwish. When Frison heard this, he couldn't believe it. I mean, of course he knew who she was. Everyone in Monaco knew who Helene Pastor was, or at least had heard the Pastor name. And so now that Frison knew the identities of his victims, his theory of this case immediately changed. He felt like there was no way the richest woman in Monaco just happened to be targeted by random carjackers. This had to be a hit. And so Frison, after getting off the radio, went back to the minivan and just looked inside. And right away, he saw there was a purse that was sitting untouched on the dashboard, which made him even more certain that this was no robbery. Very likely that would have been grabbed. But then he noticed something else. The front seats and the floor of the minivan were covered in all these rounded metallic pellets, which he recognized as being from shotgun ammunition, like buckshot, like the inside of, what a shotgun fires or can fire. And this struck Frison as being very strange. A shotgun was an odd choice for a professional hit, because it was big and bulky and you really couldn't carry it in public without attracting a lot of attention. And so this, combined with the fact that this happened in broad daylight, told Frison that very likely whoever had shot Helene and her driver was not an experienced hitman, which was also just not what he would have expected. Just then, Frison heard the sound of sirens cut through the air, and he knew his backup had arrived. A few hours later, Frison was back at the police station talking to his team, which now included one of the city's very best detectives, investigator Catherine Massinio. Both of their victims, Mohammed and Helene, had survived, at least to this point. They were in comas, and their attack was already the leading news all around Europe. But Frison was not particularly worried about, potentially not being able to solve this, because he knew he would have some answers soon. Not only had their technicians processed the crime scene and gathered swabs and other evidence from the minivan, but also Frison's officers had found 2 security cameras near the scene that likely recorded the entire shooting. So in France, it was common for cities and towns to have like a network of closed-circuit surveillance cameras that law enforcement was able to access. And Nice had more of those cameras than any other city in the country. So Frison was optimistic about what the footage might show once it finally arrived. But in the meantime, he wanted to speak to Helene's immediate family and friends and see if she had any enemies. The way Frison saw it was, Helene's daughter and son, who she was very close with, Sylvia and Gildo, they would certainly know if there was anyone who wanted their mother dead. But Frison also knew that her children were not just potential sources of critical information. They were also suspects. Frison didn't have access to the details of Helene's estate, but he knew enough about the family to guess that whatever inheritance Helene left behind was literally in the billions, which meant that her death would likely make both Sylvia and Gildo billionaires. Now, Frison didn't think that either of them had actually pulled the trigger here, but what Frison did think was that both of them definitely had the motive and the means to hire somebody else to do the shooting. But Frison had one big problem. Sylvia and Gildo, and really all of the people he really wanted to speak to, lived in Monaco. And since Frison and his team were French, and this crime had happened in France, they had no jurisdiction in Monaco. So, in order to speak to Helene's children and her inner circle, they couldn't just walk up and demand an interview. Instead, they basically had to ask nicely. The next morning, Frison sat in a very expensive-looking living room overlooking the beautiful Monaco harbor. Now, Frison had been up all night and was basically running on fumes at this point, but he hoped, that was going to be worth it, because sitting across from him was Helene's daughter, Sylvia Pastor, and her 64-year-old boyfriend, Wojciech Janowski. When Frison had reached out to Sylvia and Wojciech and asked them to speak with him, one, he had been sort of surprised at how quickly they had agreed to do it, but two, he sensed really not much emotion. Like they were sort of cold and detached and sort of quick to be like, sure, we'll meet up and chat with you about this, as if it was just no big deal. But now that he was face to face with them, it was clear that they were absolutely devastated. Especially Sylvia. Now, Frison knew as much as he wanted to ask some sort of pointed questions here, he needed to be very careful because Sylvia and Wojciech did not have to be speaking to him at this point. Like they basically are just agreeing to do this interview, and at any point they can say, enough, leave, and he would have to go. So Frison, when he began, he just started out with some very light background questions about Helene. And in a very shaky voice, Sylvia described her mother as being very tough, but incredibly generous. She said they did fight a lot, but it was just over silly things, and they were actually, pretty close. Sylvia said she'd been battling breast cancer, and her mother had always called to check in, like she really cared. When Frison asked about enemies, Sylvia shook her head, and she said, obviously, my mother is worth a ton of money, and so by default, she is a target. But she really didn't get out much. She didn't really engage with the Monaco social scene. She pretty much just worked all the time and looked after the family. Like she just kept to herself. So I certainly can't think of anybody that would have wanted to harm her. When Frison turned to Wojciech seemed equally mystified by this whole thing. He told Frison that he and Sylvia had been together for 28 years and they had a daughter together. And so, he knew Helene very, very well. And he said that, his relationship with Helene had always been great and that Helene generally was like this incredibly generous person. Especially really with him and with Sylvia. He said that even though he had his own businesses and his own income, totally separate from the pastors, Helene still would give him and his family money. The mention of finances, though, made Frison perk up. And so he asked Wojciech to be more specific about the type of financial generosity he was describing. And when he asked that question, Frison noticed there was this look of uncertainty that crossed Wojciech's face. And for a second, Frison wondered if he had just touched on something that was kind of a sore spot. But Wojciech went from looking uncertain to sort of recovering very quickly, and then an easy smile came across his face, and he explained that Helene gave her daughter and son, so Sylvia, his girlfriend, and Gildo, a monthly allowance of about 500,000 euros each, which was around 600,000 US dollars. When Frison heard this, he had to force himself not to reflexively raise his eyebrows, because this was like a staggering amount of money to get every single month as just an allowance. It was so high, in fact, that it made Frison doubt whether either of Helene's children would feel a need to kill her. If she's already giving them this much money every month, what else do you need? But Wojciech wasn't done. He cleared his throat and sort of shifted in his seat like he was uncomfortable. And then he said that, he and Sylvia used this very generous amount of money that Helene gave them on household expenses. But, Wojciech said if he was being honest, he'd heard that Gildo spent it on other stuff. Wojciech said, Sylvia's brother, Helene's son, he owned some companies that were not doing well. And so he was in very deep debt. For Frison, he couldn't tell if this was true or not, but it certainly opened up a new investigatory door. So he jotted down this information on his notepad. He was actually meeting with Gildo next. And so if Wojciech was right, then this debt was definitely a huge red flag. 45 minutes later, when Frison walked into Gildo's hospital room, he was shocked by what he saw. Now, he had known that Gildo was sick, but he really hadn't been prepared for just how sick. Gildo could barely move or speak. The only way he could communicate was actually by blinking. But nonetheless, Frison sat down by his bedside and began with a few simple questions. It took a long time for Gildo to blink out his answers, and he really couldn't communicate anything more than a few words at a time. And it was also just kind of obvious to Frison that even with these short answers, he just was not going to get much. And as time was going by, Gildo was just getting more and more frustrated with basically his lack of being able to contribute much here. And so by the time Frison left the hospital, not that long after he had arrived, he was very doubtful that Gildo was really in any shape to be planning a hired hit. The guy really was just not doing well. But, it was still possible, at least Frison thought it could be, that Gildo had begun preparations before his stroke, which had only happened 2 months earlier in March. And Frison realized the amateurish quality of the hit itself could have actually been a product of Gildo's illness. Like he had to rush the hit because he basically could barely communicate. So far, Frison thought this case was basically full of contradictions. One of the richest people on the planet had almost been assassinated by shockingly unprofessional hitmen. Both of the children, both of Helene's kids, stood to inherit billions and billions of dollars and were therefore the most obvious suspects. But at the same time, both kids were receiving an ungodly amount of money already. Like they didn't need the money. And I mean, even if Gildo was in debt, the idea that $500,000 every month isn't enough to at least keep you afloat just seems sort of fishy. And so Frizon began to wonder about Sylvia's boyfriend, Wojciech. Could he have planned the hit? Because he, not Sylvia, wanted access to Helene's money? And so Frizon pulled out his phone and he called Messinio, the very talented detective, the best in the city. And he told her about, what he saw as issues about having Sylvia and Gildo as suspects. Messinio completely agreed with Frizon. And then she shared something that she had learned during her own interviews about Wojciech. She said that one of Helene's friends told her that Sylvia had been with Wojciech so long, 28 years, without getting married because Sylvia wanted to make sure her inheritance went to her or her child or just stayed within her direct family bloodline and didn't go to an outsider, to a husband. Frizon considered what this meant. It told him that Sylvia didn't completely trust Wojciech, but it also tanked his theory that Wojciech might have planned the hit, since he had zero claim to the Pastor estate, whether Helene was alive or not. But then Messinio said something else that made Frizon stop thinking about the Pastors completely. She said she had found something out about Helene's driver, Mohammed. Mohammed was apparently involved in a love triangle, and had been for years. He was from Egypt, and he had a family there, but he also had a mistress here. And Messinio had gotten the number for Mohammed's adult son who lived with him in France, so they could just ask him about it. And so as Frizon hung up the phone, his mind was spinning. I mean, this whole time, he had thought it was so obvious who the target of the hit was. It had to be Helene. She's this billionaire. It's gotta be her. But now he was wondering if maybe the real target was Mohammed. That afternoon, Frizon was back at the station with Messinio. It had been 24 hours since the shooting, and neither of them had slept. But Frizon did not think they'd be able to do that anytime soon because the security camera footage had just arrived. And Frizon had put a lot of stock into this footage. Like, he felt really hopeful that this was going to be what they needed, because it felt like every other lead he had tried to follow so far in this case had already hit some kind of dead end. He'd just gotten off the phone with Mohammed's son, Wissam, who he had hoped, might shed some light on the possibility that Mohammed was the intended target of the attack. But Wissam had been skeptical. He did not think the lead about his father's love triangle meant very much. He said the mistress had been a part of Mohammed's life for a long time, and to be honest, nobody was particularly upset about it. Now, unlike Sylvia and Gildo, Wissam was a young and healthy man, so theoretically he could have been one of the shooters. But Frizon hadn't heard anything in their call that made him think Wissam wanted to kill his father, or Helene for that matter. So now, Frizon and Messinio began scrolling through the security footage, looking for clues that could maybe point them in the right direction. When they got to the point in the recording where the shooting actually happened, they were relieved to see they did have a clear view of the scene, and they watched it play out right in front of them. And just like the witnesses had said, Helene's car is seen turning out of the hospital parking lot, and then a man with a shotgun approached her window and fired twice. Frizon could see that the second man watched the whole thing from across the street at a snack bar, probably acting as a lookout, and then after the shooting, both men ran away on foot, and their faces were never visible in the footage. And so Frizon rewound the tape to see when these men arrived, and he saw they showed up about 20 minutes before the shooting. But it was not when they showed up that was particularly significant. It was how they showed up. When Frizon saw how they arrived, his jaw dropped, because finally he'd found a lead he could follow. Both men were separately driven to the hospital in taxis, and one of the taxi's license plates was clearly visible on screen. That evening, Frizon, Messinio, and a group of officers burst into the lobby of Hotel Azur in Nice. In Frizon's hand was a photo of both of the shooters. After calling the taxi company, everything had moved very quickly. The taxi dispatch had a record of these two men's rides and gave detectives the mobile numbers that were used to book each cab. And it didn't take long for Frizon's team to connect those numbers to 2 burner phones that were purchased just hours before the shooting at a store about 2 hours away from the hospital in a French city called Marseille. And then, by using closed-circuit camera footage, the police had been able to track the shooter's movements prior to the shooting. First, as they left that store with their burner phones, and then as they boarded a train to Nice, and then stopped at Hotel Azur before getting taxis to the hospital. So, that's why Frizon and his team were at the hotel now. In order to find out who planned this attack, they needed to ID the shooters, and they were hoping somebody here could. So, Frizon approached the reception desk with the picture of the shooters and asked the person manning it if they had seen either of the men in the photo. And the receptionist said yes. Those men had rented 2 separate rooms just the day before, but they had already checked out. And so Frizon wrote down the names the receptionist gave him for these 2 men, but the names were not familiar. Then, Frizon and Massinio split up to actually go search the rooms. Moments later, Frizon and some officers hurried into a very clean hotel room. And the receptionist had told him that this was going to be the case, because the maids had already been in and out of that room. They had cleaned it. And so for Frizon, even though he did expect, a clean room, it was still disappointing to walk in there and see it, because, had there been any evidence still in here, by now it was very likely gone. However, just then, he heard one of his officers call out from the bathroom. And so Frizon went in there and found one of his officers pointing to where a used bottle of shower gel sat on the side of the tub. Frizon couldn't believe it. I mean, he knew no other guests had been in this room since the shooters had been, which meant that gel was almost certainly theirs. The maids must have missed it during their cleaning. And so Frizon told the officer to bag it. I mean, it was a long shot, but he wanted to maybe get it sent off and tested for DNA. On May 16, 2014, investigators Frizon and Massinio paced around Frizon's office. Every now and again, they glanced at a document that was sitting on the desk. It had only been 10 days since Helene Pastor and her driver, Mohamed Darwish, were shot outside a hospital in Nice, France. Helene was still alive and in a coma, but Mohamed Darwish had died, which meant Frizon was now officially leading a murder investigation. Now, this was daunting for Frizon, but at the same time, he felt like they were close to breaking this case, because that document on his desk told him that the shower gel they collected during a search of the shooter's hotel rooms actually did have DNA on it, and it had matched to someone in their system, a 24-year-old man named Samin Saeed Ahmed, and through a series of phone taps, they'd also managed to figure out the name of Samin's accomplice, a 31-year-old man named Al-Hayir Hamadi. Now, these names were different from the ones that the hotel had given Frizon, so clearly the men must have used pseudonyms when they checked into that hotel. Now, both of them did have prior criminal records, but like Frizon had suspected, they were not like professional killers. They were just petty criminals and drug dealers from a neighborhood in Marseille that had the highest crime rate in the entire country. So it sort of did make sense that 2 men from that area might agree to carry out a hit for money. But what didn't make sense to Frizon or Massinio was how Samin Saeed Ahmed or Al-Hayir Hamadi could possibly be connected to anybody in Helene's life. The Pastors and their inner circle were some of the richest people in the world. If any of them were planning a hit, Frizon would have expected them to hire, more experienced and professional assassins. So now Frizon wondered if maybe they needed to take a closer look into other areas of Helene's life, like maybe her tenants, to see if anyone had obvious connections to Marseille. He knew from speaking with Helene's friends that she often handled many of her tenants personally, and so it was possible that maybe there was a feud or dispute that they just didn't know about. However, thousands of people lived in Helene's buildings. Going through that list would be nearly impossible, which was why Frizon and Massinio had decided that the best way to approach this whole thing was with a method Frizon called the fishing rod. Instead of arresting the shooters, Samin and Al-Hayir, they would watch them and keep their phones tapped and see if they led police to whoever hired them. However, while they were figuring all this out, Frizon's phone suddenly rang, and when he answered it, he got very unexpected news. It was the hospital. Helene had woken up from her coma. And so first thing the next morning, Frizon sent Massinio to the hospital to interview Helene, and then after sending her out, Frizon waited anxiously at the station for her to return. He was hoping that Helene could simply tell Massinio who wanted her dead, and then they could just close the case. Easy. But when Massinio came back that afternoon, she did not have good news. Helene had told Messinio that she was terrified and she had lots of things that she wanted to tell the police. And at one point, she seemed like she was on the verge of actually, giving Messinio a name or just something really meaningful. But then she'd literally just struggled to breathe and medical staff had rushed in to stabilize her and they hadn't been able to finish the interview. Frizon was so disappointed. I mean, they'd been so close to maybe hearing the truth directly from the mouth of their victim. And now they might never know. It would turn out 4 days later, before the police ever had a chance to have another interview with Helene, she died. Two weeks after Helene's death, so in early June of that year, Frizon parked his car and began to walk into the station to start his day. And he was feeling incredibly anxious because Helene and Mohammed's case had really stagnated, and Helene's death really only made the public pressure on him and his team way more intense. Frizon still had his team watching the shooters and tracing their phone calls, but so far they hadn't gotten any more leads from that. They were also slowly chipping their way down the list of Helene's tenants, but so far they hadn't found anyone with the kind of motive they were looking for. Frizon had not totally eliminated his first suspects, which were Gildo, Sylvia, and Wojciech, but he just didn't feel like any of them stood out above the rest. Gildo potentially needed a windfall because of alleged money problems, although Frizon had not confirmed that with bank records. But Gildo's poor health made it extremely unlikely he could have planned this hit. Then there was Sylvia, who was entitled to an enormous inheritance from her mother's death, but she already had a massive monthly allowance when her mother was alive and really did not seem desperate for cash at all. And then as for Wojciech, he wasn't even married to Sylvia, so he literally had no legal claim to the Pastor estate. So Helene's death really didn't do him any good. So all this was sort of going through Frizon's mind as he stepped inside the station. And as he did, right away he saw Messinio come running towards him carrying a piece of paper. And this paper was covered in lines of numbers that Frizon immediately recognized as a call log. And Messinio explained that they had traced one of Al-Hayir's recent calls and finally found a link to Monaco. The guy he called was somebody named Pascal Doriac, and unlike the shooters, Pascal had direct ties to Monaco. He was a personal trainer, and some of his clients were elite families who lived in Monaco. And a few of those clients were also people that Frizon and his team had examined in connection with the murders. Frizon grabbed the piece of paper and read and reread its contents before he finally looked up at Messinio and said they needed Pascal's phone records right now. Later that same day, Frizon was sitting at his desk staring at a name written on a piece of paper. He had gotten access to Pascal's phone records, and he discovered that every time there had been a significant event in this entire case, like on the day of the actual shooting or the days of Mohammed or Helene's death, Pascal had texted the same number. And now that Frizon knew who that number belonged to, he realized he had been at least half right the whole time. These murders were about money. Based on the police investigation, multiple confessions, video surveillance, and bank records, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Helene Pastor and Mohammed Darwish on the evening of May 6th, 2014. Around 7 p.m., the hitman named Samin Saeed Ahmed strode toward Helene's black van. And as he did, he could see her terrified face through the passenger side window as she realized what he was carrying, a shotgun, and she looked at her driver and screamed at him to drive. But before Mohammed, the driver, could hit the gas, he had raised his shotgun and fired twice into the passenger side door. And then Samin just stood there and watched as Helene and Mohammed sort of slouched forward in their seats and began to convulse. Samin didn't know who the people were he just shot. But he wasn't thinking about that. He was thinking about the payday he was about to receive for doing this. After a moment, Samin was convinced that he had been successful, that Helene and Mohammed were dead. And so he turned and sprinted away as fast as he could, knowing that his accomplice, Al-Hayir, would follow shortly after, just like they had planned. And so Samin, as he ran away, he pulled his baseball hat down over his eyes, hoping that would be enough to avoid any cameras that might be in the area. And he ran through the streets of Nice, eventually slowing to a walk before going inside of his hotel, where once he was inside, he went to his room, sat on his bed, and he called the man who hired him. Across the city, Pascal Doriac, the personal trainer, heard his phone ring, and he politely told the client he was with that he'd be right back. He then grabbed his phone and hurried out of the personal gym he had just been in, and he stepped into this grand marble hallway to take the call. And what he heard on the other end of the line was Samin telling him the good news, that the job was done. Pascal smiled, he hung up, and then he began typing out a text message. This text message was for the real killer. That is, the person who'd actually ordered the hit in the first place, to let them know that everything had gone off without a hitch. Seconds later, the real killer looked down and saw they had just gotten a text message, and it was from Pascal, their trainer. And as soon as they saw that, their heart began to race. They were very nervous about what this text was going to say. But eventually, they scooped up their phone, and they opened the message. But when the real killer read what was on their phone, they felt this enormous sense of relief that they hadn't felt in years, because their plan sort of unbelievably had worked. Then the real killer just sank back down in their comfy, expensive couch and looked out their window at an amazing view of the Monaco harbor. It would turn out Sylvia's boyfriend of 28 years, Wojciech Janowski, was lying about everything. It was Wojciech, not Gildo, who was drowning in debt. Wojciech claimed to be this very successful businessman, but in reality, all the companies that he was involved with were failing and in deep financial trouble. This had been going on for years, and Wojciech had just been swindling his girlfriend Sylvia out of her assets and monthly allowance to stay afloat. And when Sylvia was diagnosed with cancer 2 years ago, he panicked. They weren't married, so if she died, he'd lose everything. But he believed if Sylvia inherited the family fortune all at once, he could easily steal it from her and wipe out his debts. Wojciech had also been lying to investigators about his relationship with Helene. The reality was, they hated each other. Helene was very suspicious, rightfully so, that Wojciech was after the Pastor family fortune. In 2018, Wojciech was found guilty of murdering both Helene and Mohammed and was sentenced to life in prison. The other accomplices, Pascal Doriac, Samin Saeed Ahmed, and Al-Hayir Hamadi, all received between 22 years and life in prison. As for Gildo, he would eventually recover from a stroke and he moved to the United States, while Sylvia, at least as of 2025, is still alive, and she would give Mohammed's son a job and let the Darwich family live in one of our family's properties. A quick note about our stories: they are all based on true events. But we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen Podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, MrBallen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen, produced by Jeremy Bone and Cole Lacasio. This episode was written by Kate Murdoch. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, Camille Callahan, Alex Paul, Ben Fasciano. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Jordan Stidham. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song, Something Wicked, by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen Podcast. And just a reminder, every new and exclusive episode we put out on the MrBallen Podcast, you can also now watch on the MrBallen YouTube channel that very same day. And trust me, some of these stories you truly have to see to believe. Again, my YouTube channel is just called MrBallen. If you want to listen to episodes 1 week early and ad-free, you can subscribe to SiriusXM Podcast Plus on Apple Podcasts, or visit SiriusXM.com/Podcast Plus to listen with Spotify or another app of your choice. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Today's podcast will feature 4 stories that are all about ordinary people who at some point make a critical, single decision that not only changes their lives, but also impacts the lives of millions and millions of other people all around the world. The audio from all 4 of these stories has been pulled from our main YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called The Debt Game, and it's about a man in South Korea who becomes inspired by his favorite manga. The second story you'll hear is called Hospital Rhythms, and it's about a young boy in a hospital who finds solace in music. The third story you'll hear is called Storming the Castle, and it's about a young singer who takes a huge leap of faith. And the fourth and final story you'll hear is called Imposter Syndrome, and it's about an actor who hits rock bottom, but then the unthinkable happens. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload 4 times a week: Monday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Fridays. So if that's of interest to you, on the next really hot summer day, offer to make the follow button a nice fresh cup of lemonade. But don't tell them you used salt instead of sugar. Okay, let's get into our first story called The Debt Game. One afternoon in 2009, a 38-year-old man was sitting inside of a manga cafe in Seoul, South Korea. So a manga cafe is a lot like a normal cafe. You can go inside and buy snacks or drinks and socialize, do whatever. But also, in manga cafes like this one, they have these big in-store libraries that contain manga. And manga are like comic books. Now, this man did not have a lot of money. And so when he went inside of this cafe, he didn't buy any drinks or food. He just went up to the in-store library, grabbed an edition of his favorite manga series, and just sat down and began to read. Now, this man had read this particular series multiple times. He just kept coming back to it because he thought it was like the best manga you could possibly read. Now, a lot of people actually didn't know what to make of this particular series. It was actually kind of controversial because it was so over-the-top violent, like well beyond any other series. But to this man, that sort of made it stand out. It made it sort of special, and he loved it. In fact, it was so crazy, this series, that every time he read it, it allowed him to sort of leave his life for a second and just totally escape into this wild, violent story. And right now, in this man's life, he really needed that escape, because his real life was pretty terrible. He had spent practically his whole life studying and working to try to become a professional writer and director. But in Seoul, the entertainment industry was pretty unpredictable. And so this man had successfully landed a couple of jobs here and there, doing some writing and, doing some directing, but they were small gigs and they typically fizzled out at some point. And so over and over again, like right now in this man's life, he found himself back in the same position he always was in, which was unemployed. At the moment, this man lived with his mother and his grandmother. But even though all 3 of them were pooling their resources, they still struggled to just pay for rent. In fact, recently, the man had to sell his laptop, the thing he used for all of his writing. It was like how he was going to eventually crack a career in entertainment for real. He had to sell that just so that they wouldn't get evicted. And if that wasn't bad enough, the man had also begun taking out all these short-term loans with high interest rates just to pay for basic needs. Forget rent, like just food and basic necessities he was taking out loans for, but he had no way to pay them back. And so the debt was just piling up nonstop. And so for this man, the stress was like unbearable. And the only way he could find to even begin to cope with it was to escape into his manga books. And even though he knew that didn't solve his problems, he didn't care. It was like, life is so bad, at least briefly, I can read manga and escape. And so that's what he was doing today. And so he took his favorite manga booth, he sat back inside of the booth, and just allowed himself to get sucked into the story for the 20th time. He's read this thing multiple times. And so as he was reading this manga book, he suddenly has this epiphany. Now, this man all the time came up with various story ideas that maybe he could write and would be the next big thing for him. But for some reason, it was like, wait a minute, what if I write a story that's sort of, loosely based or at least inspired by my favorite piece of writing, this manga series? Like, wait a minute, I think I have a really good idea that sort of transcends any other idea I've ever had. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized there were other elements of his life that he could sort of attach to this story that's sort of beginning with this concept that came from this manga series. And so before long, he had put the manga book aside, got a pen and some paper, and just began writing down some ideas, general ideas for this new story he was going to try to write. And for hours and hours, he sat in the booth just writing like crazy. And by the time the cafe was closing, he had this amazing outline of a whole world, this whole story he was going to write. And he just knew this was the one. This was the thing that was going to break him out of poverty and officially make him a successful writer. Several months later, this man had transformed that amazing outline into a fully realized project, and then he went out to try to sell it. And he's thinking, everybody's going to want this thing. This is like an iconic, unique piece of IP. People are going to be clamoring to buy this. But what he found very quickly is every buyer he went to hated it. They told him, this is simply too weird and way too violent. Like, this is well beyond what's reasonable. This is not something anybody's going to want. Like, you will not have an audience for this. And the man was sort of crushed because to him, it was so clear. This is an amazing idea. This story is so good. People that have experienced real poverty, who understand the lengths that people will go to make money when they are desperate, they'll relate to this. Like, there's a huge audience for this. But the buyers, they didn't see it that way. And so for the next 10 years, this guy kept trying to sell this story. I mean, he really genuinely believed in it. And he figured someone's going to take a chance on this. They have to. It's too good. But for 10 years, everybody just kept saying, no, it's not good enough. No one wants this. But then, sort of out of left field, 10 years later, a major production studio actually said, you know what? This looks pretty good. We will buy it. This man's story was converted into a TV show, and it premiered in 2021, 12 years after the man originally conceptualized of the story inside of that manga cafe. And when this TV show aired, it was basically a global phenomenon overnight. It became the most talked about show anywhere in every corner of the internet pretty much immediately. It also made the production company that bought this story $900 million. And the man who actually wrote the story, he also got paid very well, and he won an Emmy. The manga series that this man read that sort of inspired all of this to happen was called Battle Royale. And in this series, these students are forced to fight to the death by a fascist government. And so what this man did is he combined that concept, fighting to the death, with something that he himself was dealing with in his own life, which was poverty. And he knew firsthand, the lengths he was willing to go just to make a little bit of money to make ends meet. And he knew other people who, were dealing with poverty were also sort of desperate, and they would go to great lengths just to make ends meet. And he said, okay, let's marry those two concepts. Poor people who were fighting to the death for money. The writer's name was Hwang Dong-hyuk, and the name of this TV series was Squid Game. Our next story is called Hospital Rhythms. In September of 1954, a 14-year-old boy named Rich shuffled his way down the hallway of a children's hospital in England. He coughed and wheezed as he slowly walked down the hall next to other sick kids as they made their way towards the hospital's classroom. Now, Rich didn't know what kind of lesson he and the other kids were going to get today, but frankly, he didn't care. Anything was better than just sitting in his hospital room, bored out of his mind. So Rich was in the hospital because he was suffering from tuberculosis, which is an infectious lung disease. And over the past 10 weeks, he'd been bouncing around to different hospitals. And in fact, his condition was still so bad that this hospital had informed his parents that Rich might need to stay in the hospital for another 2 years. And as awful as this sounded to Rich, this actually was not the first time something like this had happened to him. When he was 6 years old, his appendix burst, and then he contracted an infection that left him in a coma for several weeks. And then when he came out of the coma, he had to recover in a hospital for nearly a year. And all this time in hospitals had really impacted Rich's life, in particular in terms of how far behind he had fallen in school. And because his family was not a well-off family, they couldn't afford to hire a tutor to kind of keep Rich up to speed. And so basically at this point, Rich's education consisted of, whatever random classes these hospitals he was staying in sporadically had. Whenever they hired a teacher to come in and teach basket weaving or, shop class, whatever was available, that was his education. So that day, when Rich walked into the hospital classroom, he did not have high expectations about what he would be taught that day. He figured it was just going to be some random class that he would sit through that at least was keeping him out of his hospital bedroom. But the instant he saw the teacher for the day and saw what was surrounding the teacher, he was really excited. because all around the teacher were musical instruments. And Rich, as a kid, had always dreamed of playing the drum. He had seen one day in a Windows shop a drum set and he had wanted it so badly, but his family didn't have the money to pay for it, so he had never had a chance to do it. But now it seemed like Rich was finally going to get his chance. And so when the teacher began handing out the instruments to the kids, Rich demanded that he get the drum set. He would not play anything else. And the teacher was like, okay. And so he was given the drum. And then that day, the teacher led the class, through a couple of basic songs, and Rich played the drum, and he and everybody else were objectively terrible, like the music was awful. But by the end of the class, Rich was totally revitalized here. I mean, he hadn't discovered some special new talent for playing the drums, but he had discovered that he had this amazing passion for playing the drum. It was like all he wanted to do now. And he figured that because he was going to be stuck in the hospital for the foreseeable future, he would just spend all of his time on practicing playing the drum. So the following day, Rich went into a closet in the hospital and he found these long sticks that were normally used for knitting, and they became his drumsticks. And for the next year and a half, Rich basically banged these makeshift drumsticks on anything he could to practice. And then also every few weeks, when the music teacher came back to the hospital, Rich would go to those classes and he would try to learn as much as he possibly could from the teacher. And that was basically his whole life, was those classes and banging on everything he could. Finally, in 1955, when Rich was 16 years old, he was released from the hospital. He was finally cured from tuberculosis. However, despite having his health back, it isn't like his life suddenly got a whole lot easier. It isn't like, he left the hospital and magically became this amazing drummer and that was his life. Instead, his family was really struggling financially, and so Rich couldn't go back to school. He basically had to get a job in a factory and work full-time just to help support his family. And for Rich, he felt like that was the right thing to do. He didn't resent his family. This is what his life was. And what he did is he found joy, while he was working in grabbing makeshift drumsticks and just banging on stuff any chance he could. And he figured that that would be his life. He would just work and, find joy in drumming whenever he could. But Rich's outlook on life changed dramatically on Christmas of 1956, so a year after he had left the hospital. Because on that Christmas, Rich's stepfather had secretly saved up all this extra money by working all these extra shifts and doing whatever he could to finally buy Rich his own drum set. To this point, Rich had not been able to have his own drum set. Everything was makeshift. And so that Christmas, he gets this drum kit, and Rich is like, this is the best gift I've ever been given. And he began practicing even more. And pretty quickly, he began playing with local bands every time he had time off. And before long, he became known as like a guy in town who was like one of the best drummers. And then shortly after that, right as Rich is kind of hitting his stride being this kind of local celebrity, this local very popular band fired their drummer. And so it made perfect sense that they approached Rich and said, hey, will you join our band? And Rich said, let's do it. By this point, Rich had become known by his stage name, Ringo Starr, and that band that recruited him was the Beatles.
Our next story is called Storming the Castle.
One afternoon in the early 2000s, a young woman named Rose drove up to this huge mansion in the Hollywood Hills in California. She came to a stop outside the fence, and she just sat there for a minute feeling very nervous because what she was about to do was highly illegal. So Rose was a musician, but she definitely had not made it yet. However, she was desperately trying to break into the industry. And so her big plan today was she was going to sneak in to this mansion, which was home to arguably one of the most famous people on the planet, a big-time musician. And her plan was to give them a copy of her demo CD, because she believed if they would just listen to just one song on there, they would be blown away by her talent and they would help usher her into the industry and her career would take off. Now, obviously, she knew this could go horribly wrong, and, the owner of this home could just as easily call the police and have her thrown in jail, but to her, it felt like the risk was worth it. And so Rose got out of her car and she looked up this huge driveway that extended up this hill, and it reached this big gate that sort of blocked off the driveway about halfway up. And then the driveway beyond the gate continued up to the mansion. And from where she was standing, there really was nobody out on the property anywhere. It was totally quiet, just this massive mansion up on a hill. But in front of the gate, on her side of the gate, was clearly the gardener. And, at first she thought maybe, the gardener was going to be a problem, that of course they would see her if she tried to break into the property. But, Rose was desperate and she thought the gardener looked friendly enough. And so she decided she would go up and maybe try to convince the gardener to let her go through the gate. And so she took a deep breath, and with her demo CD in hand, Rose began walking up this first stretch of driveway. And as she got closer to the gate, the gardener stopped what they were doing and turned to kind of see what this person was doing. And, Rose was very young and charismatic, and she seemed friendly enough. And she comes walking up the driveway, and she approaches the gardener and pulls out a $5 bill and hands it to the gardener and just says, "Look, I got no money. This is my last $5. Please, will you let me go through? I just want to drop something off." And so the gardener takes the $5 and just smiles at Rose and says, "Okay, go ahead." After all, Rose is like a kid. She seems completely harmless. What's the worst that could happen? And so Rose is kind of blown away that the gardener is actually letting this happen, but she doesn't wait. She just goes right past the gardener, slips through the front gate, and starts walking right up towards the mansion. And as Rose is walking up this driveway towards the front door of this gargantuan piece of property, she's looking around at the beautiful landscaping and just how valuable and beautiful everything looked. And she's seeing all these cameras pointing in every direction. And she's just waiting for any minute, security guards to come running out here and tackle her to the ground. But nothing happened. She walked right up to this huge, beautiful front door. And again, no one's come to meet her. And so she just knocks on the front door, but nobody comes to the door. So she's thinking, what do I do? I've come this far. I really want to hand this demo CD off. And so almost like without even thinking, she just reached down and tried the doorknob, thinking, of course it's going to be locked. But no, it was open. And so she turns the doorknob and pushes the door in. And now she's looking into the home of, again, one of the most famous people on the planet, and nobody's stopping her. At this point, Rose didn't even know what to make of the situation she found herself in. She had been fantasizing about how this was going to go for weeks leading up to this, and it didn't involve it being this easy and straightforward. But here she was, and so again, without hesitation, she just walked inside this home. And as she's looking around, everything is beautiful and everything is clearly so expensive. There's all this amazing artwork and fancy furniture. There's billiard halls, there's wine cellars. This is a gorgeous property, exactly what you'd expect for the person who lives here. And as she's kind of snooping around the first floor, looking for the owner, she's amazed to see that it's like nobody's home. It's just this vacant, unbelievable mansion. Eventually, she walks around and finds there's an elevator, and so she's like, all right, I'll just get in the elevator and go up. And so she gets in this beautiful elevator, she shuts the door, she hits the button to go to the next floor, and as the car begins to move, she realizes this is gonna make some noise, someone's gonna hear me, oh my gosh, now I'm gonna get caught. And so she starts to freak out, and so she pulls out her big clunky Nokia cell phone, and she calls her mom, and when her mom picks up, she tells her that, almost certainly I'm about to get arrested here. And as her mom is like, what are you doing? What is going on here? The elevator that Rose is in came to a stop, and the door opened up. And as soon as Rose saw what was in front of her, she just lowered the phone, her mom's still talking into it, and just stared. It was like she was totally struck by what she was seeing. Because right in front of her, in the room right outside of this elevator, is the person who owns this house. The extremely famous major celebrity who's just sitting there with a guitar, strumming along, just minding his own business. And he turns and looks at Rose, and Rose is looking at him, and there's this moment of just stunned silence. Neither of them can really figure out how this even came to be. Now at this point, Rose knew it was her chance. And so even though she's unbelievably starstruck and scared and has no idea what's about to happen, she just quickly walks a little bit forward into the room and throws her demo CD onto this table that was sort of between the two of them. And this big time musician is just again, standing there staring at her what are you doing here? And after Rose did that, she didn't say anything. She just turned, headed back to the elevator, and began to make her escape. But by the time she made it back to the front door, this big-time musician's security team did catch up to her and they stopped her. However, they did decide not to call the police. And so Rose was very lucky that she escaped without a criminal record, which is sort of incredible when you consider the home she actually broke into. This was the home of Prince. Again, arguably at the time, one of the most famous people in the world. It's bad enough sneaking into anybody's home, but this is egregious. So the idea that she got right up next to Prince and gave him her demo CD without consequence, pretty incredible. But despite all this, her interaction with Prince really didn't have any bearing on her career. He didn't care at all about her demo CD. He did not, throw her name out to industry contacts and, blow her career up. Basically, he said, I won't press charges, now get out of here. That was it. However, Rose did go on to become an incredibly famous musician in her own right. She just did it without the help of Prince. Today, Rose's tracks go multi-platinum, and she's sold more than 100 million copies of her records. Rose is actually her middle name. You very likely know her by her stage name, which is also her actual first name, and that is Kesha.
The next and final story of today's episode is called Imposter Syndrome.
One day in 2008, a 50-year-old man named Carlo was at his home in Connecticut reviewing all this financial documentation. So Carlo had filed for bankruptcy a few years earlier, and it had proven to be very complicated. And there was all this paperwork he was still getting, and his bankruptcy case had not even finalized yet. And so what he thought would be sort of like a quick fix to a huge problem had turned into a really complicated mess, and now he had even more paperwork to sign. I mean, it was totally overwhelming. So Carlo was an actor, and in many ways he had had lots of success. He had been on Broadway, he had starred in shows and movies, like he was a respected actor with lots of contacts in the industry. But despite that, he hadn't really ever made it. Like he couldn't really consistently land high-paying or even consistent work, period. And so despite his reputation as being a very talented actor, it really wasn't translating to financial success. Now, this situation that Carlo was in would not have been that bad if he was single, but he wasn't. He was married with 4 children to take care of. And on top of that, Carlo also felt this really intense pressure that was sort of maybe felt in the industry in general, in the sort of entertainment industry, to keep up with his appearances. As much as he was struggling financially, he felt like he didn't want his peers to know that that might eat into his ability to get big roles. And so he's got all this pressure to take care of his family and all this pressure to maintain this idea that he's really successful and doing great. But in reality, he just felt like a total fraud. He had no money, and he felt like he didn't even know how he was going to dig himself out again. And so as Carlo is sitting there staring at this mountain of paperwork, he started to have this very dark thought that had sort of crept into his mind a couple of times over the past few months, as this huge issue just continued to get bigger and bigger. But now this dark idea had become fully realized in his mind. He began to think, maybe if I were to die, there could be a large insurance payout to my family. That would solve their financial problems, and it would also sort of, abscond me from looking like the fraud that I really am. Nobody would know. I'd be dead. They wouldn't know that I had all these issues. I'd just, be gone, and people would miss me and my family. They'd be financially taken care of. Maybe that's a possibility. Obviously Carlo was not trying to end his life because he didn't want to be here anymore. He just felt like he did not have another way out. And so he actually went to his wife and began sort of, nonchalantly asking her questions about their, various insurance plans to see if he had a good life insurance policy that would pay out if he were to go. And eventually he got his wife to tell him that, yeah, you have a very generous life insurance policy. We are good if, the worst were to happen and something were to happen to you. And at that point, Carlo felt like, that's it. That's the way to fix this problem. I need to die. However, when Carlo actually did begin researching this route, seeing exactly how, an insurance payout would work if he were to take his own life, he quickly learned that, payouts after a suicide on these life insurance plans are very complicated. And there's all these stipulations involved because, insurance companies do not want people taking their own life in order to get these payouts. And so Carlo was quickly seeing that if he were to take his life, it would not be like, okay, quick payout to his family. Quite the opposite. And in some cases, his family might not even be entitled to this payout. And so Carlo's thinking, well, okay, I can't take my own life. I need to find another way to have my life come to an end. And so he's thinking, okay, I'll start picking up really dangerous hobbies, and maybe I can sort of die by accident. Maybe I'll start hang gliding and fall out of my harness, and that'll be the way I die. And maybe that'll lead to a payout. Or I'll start doing base jumping, or all these different things that might reasonably explain why he suddenly died. But he also was thinking, people would see through that. I'm not the type of guy that picks up really dangerous hobbies, and so that could be kind of suspicious. He's like, okay, well, what else could I do? And he's like, oh, I could hire a hitman. Somebody else will kill me, and then, that's not my fault. Somebody else took my life. That'll allow for a payout, right? But, the more he thought about it, the more that too seemed highly suspicious. I mean, people don't usually get away with hired hits. And so several months go by, and Carlo is still alive because he's basically discovered that there really isn't a way to intentionally end his life, directly or indirectly, without getting caught and sort of jeopardizing the one thing he wants this to do, which is to have this payout for his family. And so he's just sort of stuck in this situation that he does not feel like he can get out of. Like, he's just completely buried by debt and this general financial crisis he's in. And so Carlo was doing really the only thing he knew he could do, which is just to get out there and audition for as many shows and movies and various acting opportunities as he possibly could to at least, get some amount of money coming in, even though clearly it was still never going to be enough. But in late 2008, Carlo got an interesting call from his agent who worked to get him some of these roles. Now, Carlo's agent, who did understand Carlo was in dire straits here, quickly explained to Carlo that, this role didn't really pay much, but, you'd be able to be a part of a very big show. I mean, yeah, your role is sort of minimal, but this is huge. It's a big credit, and, maybe it lends itself to you getting other work. This could be a great opportunity for you. Now, Carlo had heard his agent sort of pitch him on various roles and the opportunity and all that before, and so he was grateful to be, told this is a good opportunity, but he was sort of skeptical. But he received the script and he began reading about, what his character would be doing in the show. And he quickly realized that, this role actually might be more perfect for me than even the producers and directors might realize. So this role was for this particular character on the show who sort of, in the show, hides in plain sight. Like that's sort of the way they need to be portrayed. They're this huge influential character in one way, but to the eye of the audience, they sort of look like a nobody. They're sort of, again, hiding in plain sight. And Carlo, in his own life, very much felt like he was sort of hiding in plain sight. To his peers in the industry, he's this acclaimed actor who's getting all these roles and everything's so great. He's a family man with 4 kids. But privately, he's living this hell. He's got all this financial debt. He's considered killing himself for an insurance payout to pay for his life. Like he's living a completely double life here. And so he felt like, I know how to hide in plain sight. It's literally what I do every day. That's my actual life. And so he takes this role, and Carlo does such a world-class job portraying this character who hides in plain sight that the director and all these people who are working on the show, they're like, oh my goodness, Carlo is incredible, and this character that he's portraying, we gotta find a way to expand this character and make them more meaningful in this show. And so they quickly began writing in additional scenes into this big time show for Carlo's character. Again, not because the character was so good, but because Carlo was so good at portraying that character. And as this character's role grew in the show itself began to succeed even more. Like the audience was like, wow, we love that character. And so the character only grew and became a staple in this show, and it ultimately completely changed Carlo's life. Not only because this would be the opportunity that would make him massively famous and hugely successful, but also because he got paid and he was able to escape the financial hell that he was in. Through this incredible experience, Carlo would get paid millions and millions of dollars and would be nominated for multiple Emmy Awards. Now, you might know Carlo by his full name, which was Giancarlo Esposito. But if that name doesn't ring a bell, you very likely do know him from the life-changing role that he portrayed on this show. He was Gus Fring, the chicken shop kingpin from Breaking Bad.
A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events. But we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, MrBallen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen, produced by Jeremy Bone, research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio, Jordan Stidham, and Cole Lacasio. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. And just a reminder, every new and exclusive episode we put out on the MrBallen podcast, you can also now watch on the MrBallen YouTube channel that very same day. And trust me, some of these stories you truly have to see to believe. Again, my YouTube channel is just called MrBallen. If you want to listen to episodes 1 week early and ad-free, you can subscribe to SiriusXM Podcast Plus on Apple Podcasts or visit SiriusXM.com/Podcast Plus to listen with Spotify or another app of your choice. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. On May 22, 1993, a man named Kurt was carrying some boxes into his new home. He had just moved into this 2-story house along with his fiancée, whose name was Kim. Kurt went into the house and he dropped the boxes in the foyer, and then he turned back to head back down to the car to get another load. And as he walked down the steps, he passed his fiancée, Kim, and they smiled at each other. She was making her way up, he was making his way down. But seconds after they passed each other, right as Kurt got back to the car, he felt this incredible pressure and blast wave hit him in the back that almost sent him flying. And then when Kurt turned around, he could not believe what he saw. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do. So if that's of interest to you, please sneak into the Follow Button's house and replace their toothpaste with numbing cream. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the evening of Friday, May 21st, 1993, a 29-year-old woman named Kim Wenger clapped her hands together in front of her with happiness in the basement of the Golden Congregational Church in rural Iowa. Her closest friends had gathered here to throw Kim and her fiancé, 32-year-old Kurt Simon, a combination wedding shower and goodbye party, and now they were presenting the couple with their gift. It was a money tree, planted in a little yellow coffee can with envelopes full of cash hanging off of it. Kim and Kurt both smiled and began making their way through the crowd to give everybody a big hug and to say thank you. Tonight was a big night for them. All their plans were finally falling into place. Tomorrow, they would pack all of Kurt's belongings into their car, and they would drive 230 miles south from the place where he had been living in Iowa to the city of Bloomington, Illinois, just outside of Chicago, where Kim already lived. And in Bloomington, they would begin their new life together as a soon-to-be married couple, raising Kim's 2 children from previous relationships. It had been a whirlwind 8 months since they had first met on actually a blind date. Kim had known almost immediately that Kurt really was something special, but it hadn't been easy for them to get to this point. They both had almost no money. Kurt was studying to be a Presbyterian minister and living in Iowa to finish seminary school. And Kim was a single mom living in Bloomington who had just recently quit her office job because her coworker was sexually harassing her. She'd taken on off-the-books work as a hairdresser and house cleaner, but she still had to rely on public assistance to make ends meet. The long-distance relationship itself was also just exhausting, with all the driving back and forth. And it didn't help that Kim had contentious relationships with the fathers of both of her kids. Her 1-year-old son's father, Dale Fosdick, was always late with his child support payments, and he still acted like he was entitled to walk right into Kim's house anytime he wanted. Kurt had actually recently confronted him about doing that and told him to stop, which Dale did not seem to appreciate. Her 7-year-old daughter's father, Todd Wenger, really wasn't much better. Todd fought with Kim all the time over their custody arrangement, and he and her other ex, Dale, were actually friends, which really annoyed Kim. But now, as somebody handed Kim a piece of cake in the church basement, all those problems seemed like they were about to get a whole lot smaller. Kurt was moving in, and Kim was about to get her whole life organized. Waiting for her at home in Bloomington, she had a whole collection of modern bride magazines so she could plan their wedding, and she and Kurt were actually talking about Kurt maybe adopting her son. And she knew Kurt could very quickly get a job in Bloomington as a pastoral counselor, and they could maybe save some money by only having to pay for one residence now. And this money tree they were getting was a sweet start. I mean, Kim knew that the members of the congregation were not wealthy people by any stretch. But, she found it very touching that they'd pooled their limited resources to give her and Kurt such a wonderful send-off. The only thing that could make this moment any better would be if Kim's mother, Cricket, was there. But unfortunately, Kim and Cricket were estranged. Kim wished she could be closer to her mother, but Cricket had a mean streak, and for some reason, she really hated Kurt. Kim finished her cake and then checked the time, and she realized, it was time to go, so she tapped Kurt on the shoulder as he was speaking to some friends. They had a lot left to pack tomorrow morning, and they had a long drive ahead of them. So Kim and Kurt made their goodbyes and then headed out of the church holding hands. The next day was Saturday, May 22nd, and Kim and Kurt spent the first part of the day packing and then the second part driving. And then finally, at 10:30 p.m. that night, they pulled their car into the driveway of Kem's two-story house in Bloomington, the home they would now share together. Kem just sat for a second in the passenger seat while Kurt got out of the car and opened up the trunk. They had a lot of stuff to carry in, but Kem was just exhausted and frankly didn't feel like doing it quite yet. So she watched as Kurt went ahead and walked up the front stairs carrying a box and the money tree. He unlocked the door, he stepped inside, and then a minute later, he came back out empty-handed. And at that point, Kem sighed and decided she better get out and help too. Kurt was halfway back down the stairs as Kem grabbed her own box out of the trunk and walked her way into the house, into the foyer of her home. She put her box down and was about to go back outside and do another trip with Kurt when she paused. There was something she didn't recognize on the floor of the foyer that had not been there when she had left for Iowa. Kurt was outside, facing away from the house, when an intense wave of pressure hit him from behind. And nearly at the exact same time, this booming sound like some kind of explosion filled his ears. He stumbled forward almost uncontrollably and then whipped around and called out for Kem. But his ears were ringing now and he couldn't really tell if she had answered. There was smoke pouring out from the front door of their house, and instinctively he just ran into the house, into the foyer to go find Kem. When he got in there, there's all this smoke and chaos, there's shards of broken glass everywhere, and also he noticed all these little pieces of what looked like metal kind of all over the foyer. Kurt screamed Kem's name over and over, and he looked frantically all around through all the rubble, but it was impossible to see. It was like everything was destroyed in here. And so now, beginning to gasp from all the smoke, he started walking around the foyer, kind of ducking below the smoke as best as he could, and that's when he saw legs on the floor. Minutes later, Detective Larry Shepard of the Bloomington Police Department pulled up outside the two-story house in his cruiser, with his partner beside him and another squad car behind them. Shepard did not usually respond to 911 calls because he was a homicide detective, but he had happened to be in the area when dispatch requested officers go check out a report of potentially a shotgun blast on a residential street. However, the second he stepped out of his car and looked at this two-story house, Shepard knew this could not have been a shotgun blast. There was all this black smoke billowing out the front door of the house, and although Shepard couldn't see any fire, he could hear the fire alarm going off inside. And outside, the street was chaos. There were all these people who Shepard guessed must be neighbors shouting and running around, and there was debris everywhere. Broken glass and splintered pieces of wood and chunks of metal that had basically been blown out of the house out onto the street. In the driveway of this home, Shepard could see there was a man who had his hands on his head and he looked frantic, and he was yelling the name Kem over and over again as he looked towards the destroyed house. And it was at that point Shepard realized there must be someone or multiple people inside of the house, and he really couldn't wait for backup to go find them. So he and his partner shouted for everyone to stay back, and then they raced up the stairs into the smoke. Once Shepard was inside the front foyer, he could tell there was no active fire, just lots of smoke kind of hanging in the air, and he looked around and he saw there was a 6-inch hole on the wall right near the front door, and there was another hole right in the floor of the foyer. But even though he saw those things pretty quickly, his attention quickly snapped to the body of a woman who was on the ground, and it was immediately clear that there was nothing they could do for her. Literally half of her head was just missing. In his entire career, Shepard had never worked a murder case where the weapon was a bomb. But standing in this blackened, destroyed foyer over the charred body of this woman, Shepard felt sure that that is exactly what he was looking at right now. Around this point, the officers from the other squad car had now come up the stairs and into the house. But Shepard told them to get back, go back outside, because the scene was not safe to process yet. They needed the fire department here, and they needed the bomb squad, because there could be more explosives. Not long afterwards, Shepard and the other officers stood on the front lawn as members of the fire department and the state police bomb squad combed through the scene. By this point, Detective Shepard had learned a bit more about what had happened. The dead woman was Kem Wenger, and the man he had seen screaming in the driveway was Kem's fiancé, Kurt Simon. Neighbors said the pair had arrived around 10:30 p.m., and a couple of the neighbors had actually noticed them before the blast went off when they started unloading their car. These neighbors said that they saw Kurt be the first one to go inside the house, and when he did, he went in carrying a box that he had pulled from the back of the car. And then these neighbors said they saw Kurt come out again, empty-handed, but he went down to the back of the car again, and he appeared to put something in the trunk. And at the same time, Kem had grabbed a box from the car, and she went into the house by herself, and that's when the explosion happened. Shepard was troubled by these accounts. He thought it was suspicious that Kurt had been able to walk into the house without getting hurt, and then just seconds later, Kem goes in and her arrival seems to have triggered the explosion. And so naturally, he wondered if maybe that box Kurt was carrying that he went inside with, maybe that was the bomb, and he planted it. And then when he left, she goes in and it obviously goes off. And then also he wondered, what had Kurt put back into his car after he came out again? What did he put into the trunk? But even more suspicious than any of that was what a preliminary sweep of Kem's home had turned up in the basement. And that was wires, gunpowder, and fuses. Shepard did not need to be a bomb expert to know that these could be components of a bomb, and that whoever killed Kem must have built the bomb right there in her basement, which naturally made Kurt Simon the number one suspect. So Shepard told a crime scene tech to process Kurt's vehicle and pay extra attention to the trunk. Then the detective walked over to Kurt himself. And Kurt was rocking back and forth, and he was crying, and he was still just saying Kem over and over and over again. Shepard asked Kurt if he could tell him, what had happened here. And Kurt looked at him with this vacant and shocked expression, and he told the detective that he didn't know what happened. He'd gone inside with a box, and he had just started back down the stairs when he felt the blast behind him. And at this, Shepard's eyes narrowed, because according to the neighbor's account, they said Kurt was actually at his trunk, putting something back into the car at the time of the explosion. But Kurt was now claiming that he had actually only just exited the house, basically was on the stairs as the blast happened. Now, this discrepancy could just be a result of confusion, or Kurt could be lying to cover up whatever he may or may not have done. But independent of whatever this was, Shepard just told Kurt that right now he was going down to the station for questioning. Several hours later, a little before dawn on Sunday, May 23, 1993, Detective Shepard walked out of the interrogation room in the Bloomington, Illinois police station, where he'd just spent more than an hour hammering Kurt Simon with questions about his murdered fiancée. And Kurt had been a pretty difficult interview. He had plenty of ideas about other people who might have killed Kem. He told Shepard that both the fathers of Kem's children, Dale Fosdick and Todd Wenger, fought with her all the time. And he said that Kem's estranged mom, Wilma Lewis, who everybody called Cricket, was, quote, every kind of evil. But Kurt had seemed to have no information to offer about what he had actually witnessed before the explosion. He had stuck to a story that he had not seen anything suspicious at all in the foyer, which Shepard found hard to believe. Kurt also had no explanation for why the bomb exploded on Kem and not on him, and he also denied knowing anything about the bomb-making materials that had been found in Kem's basement. Kurt also said he hadn't put anything back in his trunk around the time of the explosion, but he couldn't explain why the neighbors said he had. Shepard ultimately thought Kurt was either the most unobservant person alive, or he was lying. And on top of all that, Kurt had refused to take a lie detector test. However, Shepard still had to let him go home. The detective just didn't have anywhere near enough evidence to arrest Kurt, at least not yet. At this point, the bomb squad was actually still searching the house for any additional bombs, so the crime scene techs had not gotten in yet to begin to start looking for forensic evidence. They actually hadn't even been able to remove Kem's body yet. Shepard knew the day ahead was going to be very busy. Other members of his team had spent the entire night canvassing the neighborhood and notifying and questioning Kem's family members. And now Shepard was sure there was going to be quite a few interrogations for him to conduct. He'd already been awake for 24 hours by this point, but he knew there was not going to be any sleep soon. So he walked to the office coffee pot and poured himself a cup of coffee and stood there drinking it and thinking about how he was going to nail Kurt Simon for murder. Meanwhile, the bombing itself was making huge news all across Illinois. By about 9 a.m. on Sunday morning, so less than 12 hours after the explosion, there were all these reporters milling around the front entrance of the police station, and some were even going in and out of the lobby, trying to talk to people and get any information. And Detective Shepard knew this story was only going to get bigger. because the Illinois State Bomb Squad had just called in the Federal Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, or ATF, to help them process the scene. And all that meant there was going to be an enormous amount of pressure on Shepard, who was leading the investigation. And this pressure was especially stressful this morning because the case he'd thought he'd had against Kem's fiance, Kurt Simon, was starting to fall apart. In all their interviews with Kem's friends, everyone had said Kem and Kurt had a good relationship and were excited to start their life together. The crime scene unit had searched Kurt's car, where neighbors claimed they had seen him place something in the trunk right after the explosion or manipulate something back there, maybe a detonator. But the crime scene techs had found nothing suspicious at all back there. Shepard's partner had checked out Kurt's story that he had spent the entire week previous to the explosion in Iowa, where he lived, and he was moving here to Bloomington to live with Kem. And they had found out that that story was true. He really had been in Iowa. And so this made Shepard's theory that Kurt had assembled the bomb in Kem's basement a lot less likely, since Kem was home all week and Kurt wasn't there. Plus, Kem's babysitter had given police 2 additional pieces of information that really widened the suspect pool. First, she said that the spare key to Kem's house had recently gone missing. And the second thing was, because the spare key was gone, Kem had gotten locked out at some point and had to cut a hole in the screen in the back door to get inside. And so this meant that basically anybody could have gotten inside of Kem's house to build the bomb if they just went in through the back door. Or if they, had the key, if they stole the key. So Shepard's suspect list effectively had gone from Kurt to all of Bloomington. Just before lunchtime, Shepard walked into the station's interrogation room where Kem's ex-husband, Todd Wenger, was sitting waiting for him. With Kem's fiance, Kurt, looking less and less likely as a suspect, the detectives had set their sight on Kem's exes. Both Todd, who was the father of Kem's daughter, and Dale Fosdick, who was the father of Kem's son, not only had obvious motives, but they also knew Kem's schedule, because each of them had been watching one of her children over the weekend before she was killed. Shepard's partner had actually already spoken to Dale. Basically a couple of hours after the explosion, he had spoken to him, while Shepard himself had been busy questioning Kurt. And during that exchange, Dale had seemed shocked by Kem's death, and he'd made what seemed like a good faith effort to answer the detective's questions, although his son kept crying and interrupting them. Dale did admit to having some tension with Kem, but he also had an alibi. He'd been with family in the morning and doing yard work in full view of his neighbors in the afternoon and the evening. He'd given Shepard's partner names and phone numbers of potential witnesses that could have witnessed this, and a preliminary round of calls to those witnesses had suggested that Dale was telling the truth. But the detectives were conducting all their interviews with very little information about the crime itself, because they didn't really know how the bomb that killed Kem actually worked. They weren't sure if the killer had to be, right nearby to detonate it, or if maybe it had been remote operated so the killer could be farther away, or maybe the bomb was just set to some kind of timer. Scientists at the ATF were trying to reconstruct the bomb from all the shrapnel, but until they did that, Shepard and his partner would not know exactly when the killer would have been at Kem's house. And none of the neighbors had reported seeing anything unusual around the time of the explosion that would help them narrow it down. So now, as Detective Shepard sat down across the interrogation table from Kem's ex-husband Todd Wenger, he started with some general questions about his relationship with Kem. And Todd seemed a little nervous because he kept wringing his hands while he spoke. He said that he and Kem did fight about child support costs, and he said he had been very frustrated with her because he didn't feel like she was always fair during their divorce. But he insisted that that did not mean he wanted to hurt her. He said their problems were common for most divorced couples. Shepard did not put much stock in that assertion because in his experience, divorce or breakup plus money was a very good motive to hurt somebody. So he asked Todd where he'd been all day on the night of the blast. And at this question, Todd definitely appeared to relax, and he launched into a very detailed explanation of all his movements. He said he'd been with his daughter and his new girlfriend, and both of them would definitely vouch for him, along with several people who had seen them during the day. By the time Shepard sent Todd home, he really wasn't sure which of the exes, Todd or Dale, he thought was a better candidate for his killer. Both had clearly been fighting with Kem or had real tension with Kem, but both had alibi witnesses. So, Kem's fiancé, Kurt, might have had the opportunity to plant the bomb if it was set shortly before the explosion, but he had no clear motive. As for Todd and Dale, they seemed to have plenty of motive, but no real opportunity. And so Shepard decided his next move should be to talk again to Kem's family. Maybe they would be able to help him sort out his flawed suspect list. On Sunday evening, so almost 24 hours after the explosion, Detective Shepard knocked on the door of the home where Kem's sister, Joni, lived. Now, by this point, another officer had already been there to tell her and their mother, Cricket, about Kem's death, but Shepard wanted to hear from them himself. Now, Shepard had been told that Kem and her mother were estranged, but even though he went in with some idea that this interaction could be odd, Shepard was still really caught off guard by the way Cricket was acting. It was like way over the top. As Joni welcomed Shepard inside and offered him a seat on the couch, she was crying. Her reaction to the death of her sister seemed very genuine. But Cricket was not crying or showing any signs of being sad. Instead, she was just furious, and not about the murder or about losing her child or about the fact that police had not made an arrest yet. She was furious about her child's life insurance policy, which apparently Kem had not added her to as a beneficiary, which meant that Cricket was not going to be paid any money despite her child being killed. As Shepard seeing this, he thought about how Kurt had insisted in his interrogation that Cricket was a horrible person, that she was evil. Now, at the time, Shepard had not really taken that seriously because he figured Kurt was trying to throw suspicion off of himself, and lots of people don't like their mother-in-laws. But now he was reconsidering. He felt like he was witnessing someone who could be just as bad as they were described to be. And then, when Shepard actually asked Cricket about her relationship with her now deceased daughter, Cricket went off, but not about her relationship really with Kem, but more about Kurt and how Kurt had ruined Kem's life. She said Kurt was a terrible partner for Kem and that he had destroyed the best relationship she ever had, which Cricket said was with Dale Fosdick, the father of Kem's son. She also said that Kurt had destroyed her, Cricket's relationship with Kem too. She said that she and her daughter used to talk every day, but once Kurt was in the picture, she had been forbidden to call the house at all. Now, to Shepard, Cricket seemed completely scattered, bouncing from one subject to another and just mad about everything. But he started to wonder if what he was witnessing here was not just pure selfishness and being a terrible person, but instead could be some kind of very complicated grief or maybe even guilt, or grief and guilt combined. But one thing was definitely true, which was Cricket really seemed to hate Kurt as much as Kurt seemed to hate her. And Shepard just wasn't sure which one of them was in the right. But it was around this point in the conversation that Kem's sister, Joni, cut in, and she offered up a potential suspect idea of her own. She said that Kem had recently left a job where a colleague, a man named Phil Hartman, had sexually harassed her. Following this, Kem had actually gotten a settlement out of it, and apparently Phil had made threats afterwards, including a promise to get her for this. And so Joni said it was Phil who the police really should be investigating for this murder. When Shepard finally left the house, his head was spinning. He'd gone to Cricket and Joni, hoping for clarity, sorting out his 3 suspects. But he'd come away with less clarity and now 5 suspects. Kem's fiancé Kurt, her exes Dale Fosdick and Todd Wenger, her co-worker Phil Hartman, and frankly, Cricket herself. At this point, it was late on Sunday night, and Shepard had been awake since Saturday morning, and so he decided the best thing he could do now was just go home and get some sleep. That way, he could come back with a clear head on Monday morning and maybe make sense of it then. On the afternoon of Monday, May 24th, so almost 2 days after the bombing that killed Kem Wenger, Detective Larry Shepard walked through the front door of Kem's house, feeling cautiously optimistic. On the night the bomb went off, the police had to evacuate so the State Bomb Squad and the ATF could make sure there were no additional explosives. But finally, the night before, the scene had officially been cleared, which meant Shepard could now enter the house and actually look around for himself. Inside the house, he could see that the foyer was still in complete disarray, although Kem's body by this point had been removed and autopsied. There were also now all these little flags and markers all over the place, pointing out how she'd been positioned on the floor and where various bomb fragments and other evidence had been collected. And also now, because the feds had completed a preliminary assessment of the bomb, Shepard could actually imagine how the bombing went down. There was a 6-inch hole in the foyer floor, and Shepard now knew that that was where the bomb had been placed, right there on the ground, probably concealed in some kind of a small box or package. From the autopsy, which had shown distinct damage to Kem's right hand, Shepard knew that what likely happened was that she had spotted the package and picked it up with her right hand, which then triggered the explosion. And this was actually the single most important thing the feds had been able to determine, that the bomb was motion activated. This was huge, because it meant the bomber did not have to be at or even near Kem's house to trigger the explosion manually, which meant they could have left this thing there any time during the weekend. This also explained why there were a bunch of wires and bomb-making materials found in the basement, because if the bomb had been built somewhere else and transported to Kem's house in, say, a car, the bomb could have exploded along the way. So what likely happened was that Kem's killer brought a partially finished bomb to Kem's house that would not detonate as they carried it, and then they put the final touches on it right on site, once it was actually in position in the foyer. This also meant the bomber had to be pretty sophisticated, because building a bomb like this took technical skill, it took some intelligence and real attention to detail, because if you don't have those things, you can set off the bomb and kill yourself. And so, in Shepard's mind, this likely took Kem's mother, Cricket, right off the table. She just did not strike him as organized enough or really coherent enough to build this type of bomb. She just seemed way too scatterbrained. Kem's exes, Dale Fosdick and Todd Wenger, both worked with machines for a living, so they were definitely still in. And her fiancé Kurt was highly educated, so he was still in. Shepard wasn't sure about Phil Hartman, the co-worker who Kem had accused of sexually harassing her. He had reached Phil by phone that morning, and Phil had told him he was working in Louisiana at the time the bomb went off, hundreds of miles away. But Shepard knew just being physically far away from the bomb when it went off was not a perfect alibi, because it was motion activated. You could place it and then travel and be far away. But at the same time, Louisiana was really far away, and Phil really didn't seem to have any technical background that Shepard had found, so Phil was still in, but less so. As Shepard stood there in the blackened, destroyed foyer, looking at the partially burned pages of Modern Bride magazines that had been blown all over the room, he thought about the fact that whoever had done this had to have been very comfortable in Kem's house. They had gotten inside the house at some point, and then clearly spent time in the basement tinkering with the bomb. Then they came up and they're in the foyer setting the bomb up. I mean, that's someone who's pretty confident they're not going to get caught doing all this inside the house. That's serious boldness. And so Shepard was starting to feel pretty confident that whoever had done this was either family to Kem or as close to her as family. Shepard left Kem's house thinking about how he might search both Dale and Todd's places of work to see if any of the machinery they used shared parts with the bomb. But as he stepped off the final step onto the sidewalk, he heard a voice call out behind him, and he turned to see a Bloomington police officer jogging over towards him. The bombing had created real panic, not just in Bloomington, but across Illinois. People were now terrified that there was going to be a bomb that would show up on their front porch. They would see a package they didn't recognize, and they would call the police with fears that that could be an explosive. I mean, it was like this paranoia had swept the state. And so in response to that, specifically in Bloomington, the police had a much stronger presence out on the street. And Shepard had also asked officers to recanvass Kem's neighborhood to question the neighbors again, now that they knew more about the bomb itself. Specifically, that the bomb was motion activated, which meant the bomber did not need to be there basically right before it went off. They were in the house. They were building the bomb days before. They planted the bomb in advance of the bombing. So there was a bigger window of time that they were wondering who was at Kem's house, who was acting suspicious near Kem's house in the days leading up to the bombing. Those were the questions they had for the neighbors. And so this officer that was running over to Shepard, that's what they had been doing, recanvassing the neighborhood. And when he reached Shepard, he told him he'd found something. Shepard eagerly followed the officer over to one of Kem's neighbors' houses, and there he saw a little girl, maybe 10 or 11 years old, standing nervously next to her father. And based on what this little girl would say, along with evidence collected by the Bloomington Police Department and the ATF, This is a reconstruction of what authorities believe happened to Kem Wenger on May 22, 1993. At around 10:30 that morning, the killer pulled up in their car outside of Kem's house. They picked up a bag that was sitting on their passenger seat, which contained a partially completed pipe bomb and some tools. With this in hand, they got out of the car and they walked up to the front door and they pulled a key from their pocket. This was the same key they had stolen from under the doormat a few months earlier. They used the key to unlock the front door and they let themselves inside. The killer then walked down to the basement, where they took all the various items from the bag and placed them on the counter, and they got to work. The killer was not worried about getting caught. They knew this neighborhood very well, and everybody in this neighborhood knew them, and they would not find it suspicious at all to see them there. Plus, they knew they would have an alibi for the time period when the bomb actually would go off. Once the bomb was mostly assembled, the killer gathered up most of their things. They left behind some random supplies in the basement, but figured it didn't really matter since the explosion would take care of everything. Feeling very confident in their workmanship so far, the killer walked back upstairs and placed the nearly completed bomb on the floor in the foyer. And then, as they completed the final steps, they could feel sweat beating on their forehead, because if they did anything wrong, the bomb would go off. But the killer got it all done, and they stood up very slowly and carefully and walked back out through the front door. But before they could get in their car and drive away, they saw one of the neighborhood girls playing in the yard next door. And the girl looked at them and waved and said hello. And the killer, who felt like they belonged there and no one will remember me, they waved back. Well, the little girl remembered that interaction, and she would tell Detective Shepard who she saw leaving Kem's house. It was none other than Kem's ex-boyfriend and the father of her son, Dale Fosdick. Dale was very upset that Kem had broken up with him and was now seeing Kurt. He had also heard from Cricket, who he was still very close with, that Kurt had talked about adopting his own son, and this enraged him. He couldn't stand the idea that his own boy might grow up calling another man dad. So he used the electronic skills and the tools he'd acquired from his hobby of building model airplanes to build a pipe bomb. And so ultimately, Dale was caught because of his entitlement to feel like he could just stroll into Kem's house anytime he wanted. Because he did that all the time, despite her saying not to, he became a familiar face in the neighborhood. And that's why that little girl remembered him. After months of forensic work that tied Dale even more closely to the bomb, he was finally arrested and found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to 61 years in prison. But he would only serve 14 of those years because in 2010, while still behind bars, Dale died of a sudden illness. A quick note about our stories: they are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen Podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, MrBallen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen. Our head of production is Zach Levitt. Produced by Jeremy Bone. This episode was written by Zeth Lundy. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Cole Lacasio. Additional audio editing by Jordan Stidham. Mixed and mastered by Brendan Kane. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen Podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you want to hear more like it, go ahead and check out our YouTube channel, just called MrBallen, where we have hundreds more stories a lot like this one, but most of them are not available on this podcast. They are only available on that YouTube channel, which again is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. One morning in September of 2016, a person sat in their home in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, holding a business card. And like always, just the sight of it made their stomach twist into knots. This card had been given to them years ago by a detective, and it was worn and faded from all the time the person had turned it over in their hands, agonizing over what to do with it. This detective had been looking for leads in a murder case, and at the time, this person now holding the card said they had nothing to share. But that was actually a lie. They did have information about that murder, and they'd kept it a secret for years. And now, over 2 decades later, they'd finally decided to tell the truth. But they were scared, because they knew when they did this, nothing would ever be the same. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please buy the follow button a really nice candle as a gift. But don't tell them you've replaced the wick with a firecracker. Okay, let's get into today's story. In the early morning hours of April 19th, 1991, 35-year-old Joy Hibbs lay in her bed in suburban Pennsylvania. She'd just opened her eyes when her 36-year-old husband, Charlie, hurried into their bedroom looking totally stressed out. In his hands was their new puppy, Major, who was squirming in his arms. Joy was surprised that Charlie was already awake, but he quickly explained to her that he had to go into work early today. He worked for a property management company, which was a career that allowed him to work with his hands and allowed him to not sit in an office all day, which was perfect for him because Charlie hated wearing anything but jeans and a flannel. But as Charlie passed the puppy to Joy, he told her he'd just cleaned up another accident Major had had on the carpet, and hearing that made Joy tense up. Most of the time, she and Charlie had an amazing marriage. They were high school sweethearts raising 2 teenagers, and they had just celebrated their 18-year wedding anniversary a few days ago. But Charlie's one flaw was that he had a bad temper. And so Joy was always trying to play peacekeeper, and she knew that little things like Major making a mess could totally set Charlie off. So she quickly changed the subject and asked Charlie to bring the kids in to play with the puppy before he left. Then she pulled him in for a kiss, letting his big beard tickle her face. Overall though, despite Charlie's bad temper, their marriage was a happy one. They were both a little bit out of place in their nice suburban community. They loved playing loud music and riding around on Charlie's motorcycle and smoking weed. And so it had always sort of felt like it was them against the world. And now, to Joy's relief, Charlie lightened up. He kissed her back and then left the room, and then moments later he returned, but with their 12-year-old son, David, and he sort of tossed him into the bed. They all hung out with Major for a bit before their groggy 16-year-old daughter, Angie, came in and joined them, at which point Charlie left for work. A little over an hour later, Joy stood on her front steps with her second cup of coffee, watching the kids' bus pull away from the curb. Before she went back inside, she waved to one of her neighbors who was out watering their lawn next door. Joy was close with everybody on Spencer Drive, literally. Croydon Acres, Pennsylvania, where they lived, was just outside of Philadelphia, and it was classic American suburbia with its neat manicured lawns and houses that were only about 12 feet apart. And so everybody sort of kept an eye out for each other. And that sense of sort of having each other's back on this street felt more important now than it ever had, because recently, Joy had begun to worry that Croydon Acres was sort of going downhill. The Hibbs had lived there about 7 years, and up until recently, they had never had a problem with safety. But in the last 2 months, their house had been vandalized multiple times. A brick was thrown through their window, someone slashed their car tires, and their back door was kicked in. It was unnerving, but she and Charlie had a theory about who it was: their daughter Angie's friends. Her daughter was close with a lot of kids in the neighborhood, and they were a sort of rambunctious and wild group. Angie insisted she didn't know anything about the vandalism, but Joy still wondered if maybe some high school drama had gotten out of hand. Joy went back inside to get changed and to have another cup of coffee before she headed out for the day. She worked as a medical assistant at a doctor's office, and on Fridays, they didn't open until 2 p.m., so she usually had the whole morning to run errands. But her son David had a half day today, which meant he'd be home early. So she needed to go get everything done sooner than normal so she could be home when he got back. After getting dressed and ready, Joy would spend the next few hours running around town, depositing her and Charlie's paychecks at the bank and then also grocery shopping. At around 11 a.m., she went home to take Major out for a walk. After she got back from that, she threw some laundry in, then sat on the couch and rolled a joint. This batch of weed was really good, way better than the one she had gotten a few weeks ago. That bag had been from one of their former neighbors, a man named Robert Atkins, and it had been full of stems and seeds, with basically no marijuana at all. It was so bad, Joy had actually called Robert to ask for a refund, which really pissed him off. He'd actually begun screaming at her, which, she should have expected because she was friends with Robert's wife, April, and through that relationship, she knew Robert was a really angry guy. The Atkins used to live 2 doors down, that is until the bank foreclosed on their home. Now they were living about 15 minutes away. Now, Joy had not told her husband Charlie about the fight she'd gotten into over this bag of weed. She knew he would be furious if he heard Robert had yelled at her, and so she didn't want to start a war between their families. Just then, there was a loud knock on her front door, which made Joy immediately sit up because she was not expecting anyone. And when she went to look out the window, she saw the last person she wanted to see while smoking pot, a reverend. She had no idea why he was there, but she ran to the bathroom to throw her joint in the toilet, then waved a hand through the air to try to get rid of the smell before opening up the door. Moments later, Joy was sitting on her couch with Reverend Fury Orlando and another member of the Ben Salem Baptist Church. Joy had gone there with a coworker 3 weeks ago on Easter, and she'd completely forgotten that she told the church she was interested in joining. But that was why the men were here now, to follow up and see if she had any questions. The Reverend spent the first few minutes of his visit just telling Joy about the congregation and the worship style, but then he surprised Joy by asking if she was sure she would go to heaven when she died. And this question gave Joy pause. Now, of course, she'd considered what might happen after she died, and she did believe in heaven, but the Reverend asked if she was sure she would get in. And honestly, she was not sure. Now, she was generally a happy and kind person and tried to be good to people, but recently she'd begun to wonder if maybe she was missing some deeper spiritual meaning in her life. Reverend Orlando seemed to sense her stress and just took her hand and said they should pray. So, the Reverend, Joy, and the other congregation member bowed their heads as the Reverend said a prayer. And while he did this, Joy found herself crying, tears of relief. It was like somehow his prayer had made that sudden, unexpected wave of anxiety when she thought about whether she'd get into heaven, it just completely disappeared. She felt completely at peace. Joy walked the 2 men out of her home at 11:50 a.m. and told them she would see them in church on Sunday. She waved as they drove away, then she went back inside and closed the door. Then she would spend the next half hour or so folding some clothes, and then she went to David's room to put some of it away. And as she did this, she heard the back door open and thought it must be her son, David. However, the footsteps that stomped through the house were definitely not her son's. They were heavy and forceful, and they were headed right towards her. About a half an hour later, around 1 p.m., Joy's son David got off his school bus in front of his house, and the first thing he saw once he got off was his mother's car in the driveway, which made him smile. It meant she had not left for work yet, so he could tell her the news. He just got his report card and he made the honor roll. And so David hustled towards the back door, but as he passed by the kitchen window, he suddenly froze. There was smoke pouring out of it, and it took him a second to process it. His house was on fire. He gasped and ran to the back door, and when he opened it, a ton of smoke and flame shot out. And so did Major, the puppy. It ran straight from the house and out into the yard. In a blind panic, David yelled out for his mom, but he didn't hear anything back. All he could see was this wall of smoke and flames, and he knew he could not go in there safely. And so he turned and began running towards his neighbor's house, screaming for help. 10 minutes later, a firefighter ran towards the burning home on Spencer Drive with a team of firemen and their gear. He knew they needed to act fast. He had been told there could be someone still inside, and so paramedics were already at the scene and on standby in case there was. The team charged into the burning kitchen and doused the room with water. At the same time, the lead firefighter called out repeatedly to see if anybody was there, but there was no answer. As they continued to put out the flames, the lead firefighter saw why this accident likely happened in the first place. Someone clearly left all the stove burners on. The firefighter turned them off, and after the kitchen fire was out, they entered the hallway to extinguish the flames there too. Finally, they reached the last part of the house that was also on fire, which was a bedroom. They hosed down the flames, and as the smoke cleared, the firefighters noticed there was a long, charred shape on top of what used to be a bed. One of the firefighters realized what they were looking at which point he turned and left the burning building to go speak to the chief. They had just found a fatality. The next afternoon, Sam Wisniewski, a detective with the Bristol Township Police, stood in front of a half-burned-down home on Spencer Drive. The firefighters had come and gone, and the place was now swarming with crime scene techs and police officers. Until that morning, everyone had believed that this was an accidental fire with a casualty, a 35-year-old woman who had been identified as Joy Hibbs. But then the medical examiner had conducted Joy's autopsy, and even though her body was clearly badly burned, it was also clear that her death was not caused by the fire. Joy had been murdered. She had stab wounds all over her chest, she had broken ribs, and she'd also been strangled. And there was no smoke in her lungs, which meant she died before the fire started. So Wisniewski was the lead investigator on what was now a homicide case, and he was already 24 hours behind. But he did have an early working theory. And that was, since multiple violent methods were used to kill Joy, the attack had to be emotional and frenzied, and in his experience, strangulation and stabbing were common in personal crimes since they required getting so close to the victim. And so what that told him was that Joy likely had a relationship with her killer. But proving that might be hard, since the case already had some pretty big problems. Not only was Wisniewski getting to the scene an entire day after Joy was found, but when he actually stepped inside the home, he could see the crime scene itself was completely contaminated. The firefighters obviously had not been focused on preserving evidence, and though parts of the house were untouched by fire, a lot of it was burned and then soaked and trampled all over. Wisniewski also knew he would not be able to see if this had been a robbery or not, since, missing items could have also just been burned up. And so Wisniewski did an initial loop of the property to check the doors and windows, and he didn't see any signs of forced entry. So Joy either let her attacker in, or the door or a window had been unlocked. Then Wisniewski went to the bedroom where the body was found. He'd been told it was the son's room, and that Joy had been lying face up on the bed. And when he got inside, he could see it was by far the most damaged part of the house, which must have been intentional. By this point, the firefighters had confirmed this was indeed arson. They'd actually found 4 separate fires in different areas of the home. So Wisniewski guessed the killer must have set fire to Joy in this room first, since it was where most of the evidence of the crime would be. After he finished in the bedroom, Wisniewski looked around the house a bit more, but he didn't find much else. So he told the crime scene techs to collect what they could, then he went outside to speak to the neighbors. A few hours later, Wisniewski jumped into his cruiser and headed back to the station. And he had a lot to do. Because while the actual crime scene had sort of been a bust, the neighbors were hugely helpful. Their houses were physically close together, and the weather had been nice yesterday, so a lot of windows and doors were open. And this meant multiple people saw Joy alive and walking the dog at 11 a.m., and then right after that, they saw Joy let 2 men into her home. And they were very noticeable, because one of them was a reverend. In fact, one of the witnesses recognized him as the reverend from Ben Salem Church. Wisniewski had been pretty surprised to hear this. These 2 men were the last known people to interact with Joy before her death, which made them instant suspects. But this was a bizarre lead. Religious figures were not typically involved in murder cases. But the neighbor said the reverend and his partner left before 12, which put them out of the likely range for when the fire started. Joy's son David got home around 1 p.m., and if the house had been burning for over an hour at that point, it certainly would have been way more damaged, and the neighbors likely would have noticed before David got home. Now, the reverend and his partner could have killed Joy, then returned to the scene to cover it up later, but that just felt far-fetched. At the very least, though, they could have seen or heard something important while they were there. And so regardless, Wisniewski knew he had to speak to them. He also wanted to speak to Charlie Hibbs, Joy's husband. In a murder, the spouse was always the first suspect. And even though none of the neighbors had reported seeing Charlie around the time of the murder, Wisniewski still thought he made more sense as the killer than the reverend or his partner. On Sunday, April 21st, so 2 days after Joy's body was found in the fire, and 1 day after the case was declared a murder, Detective Wisniewski sat down with Joy's husband, Charlie Hibbs, in an interrogation room at the police station. Some of Wisniewski's officers were currently at Ben Salem Church speaking to the Reverend. That way, right now, Wisniewski could just focus on Charlie. Currently, Charlie was hunched over and quiet, and his hands were visibly shaking. No one had told Charlie yet that the police knew his wife had been murdered, and so Wisniewski wanted to see how he reacted when he heard the truth. When the detective broke the news, he watched as Charlie went from shock to confusion and then finally to horror. And then after that, he just buried his face in his hands and sobbed. Charlie's devastation appeared genuine, but Wisniewski knew he could just be a good actor. So he waited for Charlie to calm down and then asked him what his relationship with his wife had been like. Charlie's voice shook as he told Wisniewski that they had been married since high school when Joy accidentally got pregnant with their daughter. Now, the pregnancy was a shock at first, but the decision to get married as a result of it turned out to feel like the right one, and they both agreed that they likely would have gotten married at some point anyways. Charlie said Joy was the best thing that ever happened to him. She was gentle and kind, and she humored his deep love of motorcycles, and he just couldn't believe she was gone now. Wisniewski could see Charlie was getting very upset again, so he changed tracks and asked Charlie where he was between 11 a.m. and 1 p.m. on Friday, April 19th. Charlie said he was at work about 20 miles away at a construction site in Philadelphia, and he had been there until a coworker told him that his house was on fire. So he went home right away and he saw the flames and the firefighters and then his wife's horribly burnt body being wheeled out on a stretcher. Wisniewski wrote all this down. He would need to confirm Charlie's alibi, but if he was at work, then he obviously did not kill Joy himself. Now, he could still be involved. It was possible he'd hired someone to do it. But if this were a hit, Joy's murder would have likely been more colder, more efficient, rather than frenzied. So the next thing Wisniewski asked was if Charlie could think of anybody close to Joy that she was maybe fighting with, or if anybody had ever threatened her or their family. And this made Charlie frown, like something had just occurred to him. And he said, not really, but in the last 2 months, there had been some vandalism at their house. Joy's tires had been slashed, and somebody broke their back door. They just sort of assumed it was their daughter Angie's friends, but maybe it was something else. Wisniewski immediately asked Charlie if he had the names of these friends. Now, of course, this could be nothing, but it could also mean that someone or multiple people had been threatening Joy for months before her murder, and Joy simply hadn't realized how serious it was. Charlie told Wisniewski he could ask Angie himself, because his kids were waiting in the lobby. Moments later, David and Angie joined their father and Wisniewski in the interrogation room. Their eyes were red from crying, and Wisniewski decided not to reveal the fact that their mom had been murdered. Their dad could eventually tell them that. Instead, he just asked them if they knew of anybody who might have wanted to hurt their mother. Now, what Wisniewski expected was that these kids would just say no, and that he would just start in on Angie, asking about her friends and the vandalism. But that's not what happened. Instead, Joy's son David spoke up, and he said yes, he knew someone who would want to hurt his mom. It was their former neighbor, Robert Atkins. After David said this, he sort of froze and looked nervously at his dad, like his dad might be upset with him. But his dad just looked confused and told David to continue. So David turned to Wisniewski and said that Robert was this scary guy and his parents bought weed from him a few weeks ago. And he said he knew this because he actually overheard his mom on the phone with Robert asking for a refund, since apparently the weed had been so bad. And when she asked for that, David said he could hear Robert get really mad on the other end and literally threaten to kill her and blow up their house. Wisniewski couldn't believe what he was hearing. Not only was Joy's life being threatened just before her murder, but it was over a drug deal. It was not what he expected out of somebody he'd assumed to just be a typical suburban mom. And if Charlie or Joy were frequent drug users, that could have put them in touch with a rough crowd. And so now Wisniewski could kind of understand why David had been hesitant about what he just said. Back in 1991, marijuana was still very much illegal, and David probably did not want to get his parents in trouble. But Wisniewski said he didn't care about the drugs at all right now. He told David and Charlie that, the weed was not his priority. His priority was figuring out what happened. And so Wisniewski turned to the dad, Charlie, and asked him to tell him everything he knew about Robert Atkins. Charlie nodded and took a shaky breath. Then he admitted they did buy some weed from Robert. It had been a crappy batch, and he had known Joy tried to return it, but he didn't know anything about the threats that followed. By the end of the interview, Wisniewski did still want to talk to Angie's friends, who her dad had suspected of vandalism, so he got their information from Angie. But far more pressing than that was tracking down and speaking to Robert Atkins. Later that evening, Wisniewski sat in his office strumming his fingers on his desk. He had spent the whole day following up on the drug-dealing neighbor, Robert Atkins, and what he had learned was that Robert definitely had a bad temper. In fact, one of Robert's neighbors had just called into the police station to say that Robert had threatened to kill her when she had accidentally left some tree branches in his yard after trimming her hedges. Wisniewski also found out that Robert had a criminal record, although the charges were all minor, nothing violent like what happened to Joy. But it was all certainly enough for Wisniewski to consider Robert a strong suspect, and so the detective really wanted to speak to him. Except it turned out that was not going to be possible, because right after he did a background check on Robert, he got a call from a senior officer in the county's narcotics division, and the officer told Wisniewski to hold off on interviewing Robert Atkins. He apparently was one of their drug informants. They didn't want to scare Robert off and lose him as a source of information, so Wisniewski was ordered to let the narcotics department handle it. And Wisniewski was pretty angry about this, but he also understood that you don't mess with somebody else's informant, so his hands were tied. He had no choice but to wait, which was especially frustrating because he didn't have any other leads to follow up on. Nothing had come from talking to Angie's friends and classmates, and the crime techs hadn't found anything useful at the house, no fingerprints and no physical DNA evidence. And Wisniewski also heard back about the meeting with the Reverend and his partner. Both of them had alibis for the hour after they left Joy's house, which Wisniewski had already confirmed, so they could not have been at the house when the fire started. They also hadn't seen or heard anything strange when they were there, although the Reverend had said Joy seemed very troubled when he asked her about heaven. And all this was starting to make Wisniewski want to bang his head against a wall when an officer charged into his office with some news. They'd interviewed some more neighbors, and two of them saw something else: a dark blue Monte Carlo parked in front of the Hibbs' house between 12:30 and 1 p.m. on the day Joy died. They noticed it because it was parked against traffic and far from the curb, like whoever was driving it had been in a hurry. No one took down its license plate though, which Wisniewski knew made things more difficult. Monte Carlos were really common cars in this area, and then more broadly, there were likely thousands of them driving around the whole state. But then, the officer said they already checked their suspects, and the husband, Charlie Hibbs, did not own a blue Monte Carlo. However, the drug dealer, Robert Atkins, the former neighbor, did. On April 24th, 5 days after Joy Hibbs was murdered, Detective Wisniewski sat in an office in the narcotics department with a few other officers. Wisniewski had been pushing for Robert Atkins to please be brought in as a suspect, and finally he had gotten his wish. Robert had been formally interviewed. But Wisniewski was ordered to sit on the sidelines while investigators on the narcotics team went to Robert's house and spoke to him. So now, Wisniewski was being briefed on what they had learned. Apparently, Robert had admitted to selling Joy some weed and getting in a fight over it. But he said he didn't threaten her, he just refused to give her a refund. And anyway, Robert had an alibi, since he was on his way to the Poconos with his family when Joy was killed. 2 officers had driven to the Poconos, which is a mountainous vacation spot about 2 hours from Croydon, to check this out. And they went to the hotel that Robert said he'd stayed in, and they showed the front desk a photo of him, and they confirmed that he was there around the time of the murder. Wisniewski sighed and rubbed his eyes. He was exhausted, and still pretty upset that he was being kept away from a murder suspect just to save whatever drug investigation they were working on. But he did have to admit, Robert was looking less and less guilty here. Also, a neighbor who had seen that Monte Carlo in front of Joy's house had been taken to Robert's to identify his car. And when the neighbor saw it, they said it was not the same Monte Carlo. So Wisniewski said goodnight to his colleagues and then headed back to the office to go over the case file and look for something he could have missed. And sure enough, later that day, as Wisniewski was sifting through his files, he saw something that he hadn't noticed earlier. One witness had said somebody else in Joy's life outside of Robert Atkins had a bad temper, and it was her own husband, Charlie. Now, one passing comment was not exactly evidence, but it made Wisniewski think back to his conversation with Charlie. Charlie admitted to being effectively forced into marrying Joy because of a pregnancy, and so maybe he'd become resentful he'd gotten married so young and wanted to be free. Like all Wisniewski's suspects, Charlie had a solid alibi. But Wisniewski also knew from their conversation that Charlie was very into motorcycles and sort of part of the biker scene. So he potentially ran with a, rough biker crowd. And so maybe he asked one of them to take care of it for him. Wisniewski always thought that Joy's injuries showed a personal level of rage, but maybe they were just the frenzied work of a violent biker who was doing his friend a favor. About a month after Joy's murder, Wisniewski had Charlie back inside of an interrogation room. And Charlie clearly had not been sleeping, because he had dark circles under his eyes and he seemed disoriented. But Wisniewski was not about to go easy on him. Because right now, Charlie was his only suspect, and Wisniewski was ready to ask all the hard questions, like if either of them were having affairs, or owed anyone money, or if he abused Joy. But when he asked outright if Charlie had killed his wife, Charlie just broke down, shook his head, and sobbed. And when Wisniewski asked if he would take a polygraph, to his surprise, Charlie said yes, and that he would take as many as they wanted. Over the next few weeks, Wisniewski repeatedly questioned Charlie, picked apart his alibi, and oversaw multiple polygraphs. But Charlie passed every single one. And even after speaking to his kids again, Angie and David, Wisniewski just could not find anything that directly connected Charlie to the actual crime. So Wisniewski kept looking for other suspects and conducted dozens and dozens of interviews. But after 3 months of investigating, it all sort of went nowhere. Wisniewski had cleared all of his suspects, and so by the end of the year, the case went cold. 23 years later, on an afternoon in April of 2014, a detective named Michael Slaughter sat in a dusty evidence room sorting through a box labeled Joy Hibbs. The department had just ordered a complete review of all unsolved homicide cases, and Slaughter asked to take on Joy's. He'd heard about the case and couldn't believe that more people were not talking about it or pushing for it to get solved. After all, it was an innocent mother brutally attacked and murdered in her son's bedroom in this classic suburban neighborhood. Like, it was so tragic and so unusual. Wisniewski by this point was retired, so Slaughter was working this case as a true fresh slate. Right now, he was just gathering reports and documents, but he intended on re-interviewing as many witnesses and suspects from 1991 as he could. And as he got organized, he went over the 3 original suspects to see if he noticed anything odd in the 1991 investigation that might have been missed. He agreed with Wisniewski's theory that Joy was killed in an emotional, frenzied crime. But he could see that the closest person to her, her husband Charlie Hibbs, had passed multiple polygraphs, had an alibi, and fully cooperated with the investigation. Now, it was true that he had had to marry Joy because of an accidental pregnancy, but they'd continued to live together for 18 years and had another kid, so Slaughter really didn't think that was a strong motive. Then there was Robert Atkins, who threatened to kill Joy over a drug deal. But Robert Atkins seemed to make a lot of threats to his neighbors, most of whom did not end up dead. Plus, he had been 2 hours away at the time of the murder. It did bother Slaughter that the drug cops at the time had blocked Wisniewski from speaking to Robert, but a cheap weed deal didn't seem like a very good motive for a brutal murder. As for the Reverend and his friend, they were literally seen at Joy's house right before she was killed, which was obviously very suspicious. But other than the timing, they never made very good suspects. They had no motive, and both of them had alibis for the period of time when the fire likely started. Slaughter spent the next few weeks following up on leads and conducting interviews. He was determined to talk to everyone, not just the original suspects, but all their friends, their neighbors, relatives, witnesses, and coworkers. But the weeks turned into months, and then years, and Slaughter still had not found Joy's killer. It was not until 2 years later, on September 11th, 2016, that Slaughter finally got the break he'd been desperate for. That evening, he had just sat down to dinner with his family, which, like always, made him think of Joy and this case. Because here he was, a regular husband and father, who also spent his days looking for murderers. Sometimes it felt like he was living multiple lives at once, just like basically everyone involved in the Hibbs case. Slaughter had spent the last 2 years trying to understand not just Joy, but everyone in her life. And it had been very hard, because no one in this case was who they said they were. Joy was a suburban mom who was afraid she wouldn't go to heaven and smoked pot. Charlie Hibbs was a reliable company man who also ran with a rough motorcycle club. Robert Atkins was informing on drug dealers while also working as a drug dealer. All that's to say, Slaughter still had not figured out if any of those people were also killers, and he was starting to worry he never would. But as he sat down to dinner that night, his phone rang. And when he picked it up, a police officer on the other line said somebody was at the station asking for him. And when Slaughter heard who it was, he realized the last 2 years of research and interviews and getting to know everybody had actually paid off. Because one of the many people he had spoken to was finally ready to come forward. Slaughter leapt up and rushed to the station. And as soon as he got into an interview room with this new witness, that person explained that they had been lying for 25 years. And when they finally told this truth to Slaughter, one of Slaughter's suspects' alibis completely fell apart. Based on the police investigations of 1991 and 2014, and also witness reports, here is a reconstruction of what investigators believe happened to Joy Hibbs on April 19, 1991. On April 19th, just after 12 p.m., the killer sped through Croydon. They were so angry they could barely see. They had been thinking and stewing about Joy all day, getting madder and madder, because Joy acted like such an upstanding person, but really, the killer knew she was a double-crossing lowlife. When they got to her house, they screeched to a stop and jumped out of the car. Then they took out their knife. The killer stormed to the back of the house and barged in through the kitchen door, which was the entrance the family used. When they got inside, they saw Joy lean out of David's bedroom to look at them. And when she saw the killer and the knife in their hand, she looked more confused than scared. But when the killer rushed towards her, she opened her mouth to scream. But the killer was on her before she could make a sound, stabbing her with one hand and hitting her with the other. The killer pushed her onto her son's bed and continued to beat and stab her before grabbing a computer cord. And they wrapped it around her neck and they strangled her until Joy stopped moving. Then the killer, who was now panting and totally out of breath, they backed away. They were still filled with adrenaline, and they knew they didn't have a lot of time to cover up their crime. So they searched the house until they found a lighter, and they put magazines and books all around Joy's body, then they lit them on fire. Then the killer started another fire in the hallway before going to the kitchen, where they turned on all the burners and also ignited the trash. Then the killer left, sped back to their home, and told their family to pack their bags. They were going on vacation. It would turn out Joy's drug-dealing neighbor, Robert Atkins, had lied about everything. He actually was furious with Joy over the weed incident, which might not have been a big deal to anyone else. But Robert was an incredibly violent person, and he was absolutely enraged. After killing Joy, when Robert got back home, he was literally covered in blood. And he told his wife, April, that he had just stabbed someone and set their house on fire. And then before his wife could really react to this, he took her and the rest of his family upstate to the Poconos to create his alibi. And Robert's wife, April, had lied about this for decades, mostly because she was scared of Robert. However, after Detective Slaughter interviewed her in 2014, she held on to his business card for 2 years until she finally got the courage to come forward and tell the truth about her husband. And once she did, detectives rechecked Robert's alibi, and they realized that while the 1991 investigation confirmed that the family had checked into a hotel in the Poconos, they hadn't correctly noted the time. The hotel was about 2 hours away, and April and Robert did not sign the registry until almost 5 p.m. on the day Joy was killed, which meant Robert would have had plenty of time to murder Joy first. After coming forward in 2016, April had to work with detectives for years to gather up enough evidence to actually prosecute Robert. He was finally arrested in 2022, 31 years after killing Joy, and he was quickly convicted of murder and arson. He is currently serving a life sentence without parole. A quick note about our stories: they are all based on true events. But we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen Podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, MrBallen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen. Our head of production is Zach Levitt. Produced by Jeremy Bone. This episode was written by Kate Murdoch. Story editing by Karis Pash Cooper. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Cole Lacasio. Additional audio editing by Jordan Stidham. Mixed and mastered by Brendan Kane. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen Podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. There's this one, the MrBallen Podcast, as well as Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, Run Fool, Redacted, Late Nights with Nexpo, and A Twist of History. All you have to do is search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories just like this one, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Today's podcast will feature two horrifying stories that both take place out on the open sea. The audio from both of these stories has been pulled from our main YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called The Perfect Bait, and it's about a fishing trip that turns into a tragedy. And the second and final story you'll hear is called The Gray Blanket, and it's about Japanese fishermen who endure a 2-week-long nightmare that would mark the first time in history humans experienced a particularly terrifying phenomenon. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, the next time the follow button is fast asleep, secretly take their phone and change their language setting to Chalcatongo Mixtec. Okay, let's get into our first story called The Perfect Bait. At around 1 a.m. on August 27, 2000, a fisherman named Sam Watts did his best to keep his balance on the wet deck of the huge commercial fishing boat that he was working on. And as he tried to do that, he looked over at his crewmate, Michael Edwards, another fisherman, who was grabbing onto the mast as the ship rocked underneath their feet. Sam and Michael and the 4 other crew members on board this boat had just dropped their anchor 56 miles off the northeast coast of Queensland, Australia, and up until about an hour earlier, the sea had been very calm. But now, this huge storm had rolled in, the wind had picked up, the waves were huge, and while the 4 other crew members had already gone below to try to catch some sleep, Sam and Michael were now on the deck, doing their best to try to secure everything before they went down below. And so as the wind is whipping and the waves are smashing against the side of this boat, Sam and Michael decide they should split up to work more efficiently, where Sam will go to the front of the boat, and Michael will go to the back of the boat, and they would each kind of work towards the middle of the boat, checking all the fastenings and the knots to make sure everything was good. And then when they reached the center, they would be good, and they could go down below. And so they did that. Sam went to the front, Michael to the back, and as they began to work, they kept constant eye contact with each other because this was obviously a very dangerous thing they were doing. But at some point, as Sam was making his way, he had to duck down to check a particular fastening. And so when he ducked down, he lost sight of Michael just for a second. But in that split second, this huge rogue wave smashed the side of the boat, practically capsizing it, sending Sam flying towards the railing. But Sam luckily grabbed onto the railing before being thrown into the water. And then as the boat kind of began to rock back to level, Sam instinctively looked back down the ship to look for Michael. And he watched through the darkness and the rain as Michael went careening off the side into the ocean. He hadn't been able to grab onto anything.
And so the instant the boat kind of leveled out again, Sam screamed for Michael, but he couldn't see him. And so he ran down below, woke up the whole crew. And so moments later, the crew was on the deck. They had their big spotlights out, scanning the water, through this big storm, looking for signs of Michael. And at the same time, the captain had come up and he was on the radio talking to police. And so several minutes later, a police boat managed to come out to the fishing boat. And at the same time, the crew is still desperately looking for Michael. They haven't found him yet. And now the police began circling around the whole area, calling out for Michael, throwing out buoys into the water in hopes of, maybe Michael sees one and grabs hold. But nobody could find Michael. He was just gone. And so all that morning into the early afternoon, the police continued to look in the area for Michael. The crew on board the fishing boat did the same thing. But still, nobody could find a trace of Michael. And so around noon that day, the search was called off. And the police told Sam and the rest of the crew of this fishing boat that unfortunately, at this point, it seemed very likely that Michael had drowned. And so, of course, Sam and the rest of the crew were basically in shock. I mean, this happened so quickly. How could it be that, Michael just a few hours ago was joking around with them, part of the crew, and now he's dead? I mean, it was just unbelievable. But now, unfortunately, Sam and the rest of the crew had to basically put their grief aside and make a very practical, albeit very cold, decision, which was, even though Michael's dead, do we stay out here and continue fishing? Or because of his death, do we just go back home? And you might think that decision was actually super easy to make, that of course, they would pack it in and go back home. How could you possibly stay out here and go fishing considering what had happened? But you need to understand it cost a lot of money to go out on these fishing excursions, and they had just left, and so they had not caught anything. So they had spent all this money and they had no return from it. And these fishermen were not wealthy. In fact, honestly, they needed the money from this trip just to provide for their families. And so if they did turn around right now, it would really hurt all of them. And it would also make it really hard to get the funding again to go out later. And so after some pretty awkward deliberation, the crew decided that, we got to stay out here and fish. But the silver lining was, hey, if we stay out here for another day or so, maybe Michael's body will float to the surface and we can at least recover him and bring him back home to his family. And so all day that day, the fishermen stayed out and fished, and they were very successful. One after another, they were catching these cod that were 6 feet long and nearly 100 pounds. They're called flowery cods. But despite how incredible this was for their business, this was not a cause for celebration because they had just lost their friend the day before. And so it was a very somber day. And all day, all the fishermen really are looking out at the water, hoping to see Michael's body. But, by the end of that 24 hours of fishing, they didn't see any sign of Michael. And so they packed everything in and they headed back to port. They sold off all of their cod that they had bought. And then each of the fishermen went back to their families and grieved the loss of their friend. A few days later, a factory worker was standing in front of a fish processing line with this huge 97-pound cod right in front of them. This is one of the flowery cods that Sam and the other fishermen had caught 24 hours after their friend had gone overboard. And so this worker took their knife and, like they did every day all day long, began opening up this fish. And at some point, after cutting it open and looking inside of this enormous cod, the worker just stopped and couldn't believe what they were seeing, and then they began to scream. It would turn out a few days earlier, after Michael had been thrown overboard during that storm, he very likely had been alive when he hit the water. But the area where they were fishing off the coast of Queensland, Australia, was known for having lots of sharks and saltwater crocodiles in the area. And so pretty much immediately, Michael was attacked by either a shark or a crocodile, or maybe both. And during this feeding frenzy, as Michael's getting ripped to pieces, his head got ripped off and began to float away. And at some point, one of those huge flowery cods saw the head and ate it whole. And then later that day, Michael's colleagues caught the cod who caught Michael's head. And so that factory worker who opened up that particular cod saw Michael's undigested head looking up at her, and apparently his face was fixed in terror with his eyes wide and his mouth open as if his final moment had been him screaming.
The next and final story of today's episode is called The Gray Blanket.
At around 1 a.m. on March 1st, 1954, a 20-year-old fisherman named Oishi Matashishi finally headed down to his bed on the lower deck of the fishing boat that he worked on, which was called the Lucky Dragon No. 5. Oishi was totally exhausted. He and the other 22 crew members had been working practically around the clock, 18-hour days for the last 6 weeks, trying to catch tuna, but so far, this trip had really been a disaster. They had gotten stranded on sandbars, there had been these terrible storms that had nearly capsized the boat, and then also they had lost a lot of their fishing lines when they got snagged on coral reefs. And so, as a result, their tuna hauls so far had been devastatingly low. And Oishi and the rest of the crew were very aware of this. In fact, Oishi was very worried that he would not bring home enough money to support his family. Back when Oishi was 14 years old, his father, who had been the breadwinner for their family, had been crushed to death when he was repairing a ship. And so now Oishi had stepped into that patriarch role, taking care of his mother and his 5 other siblings. And so Oishi really needed a solid paycheck from this trip, and it wasn't looking like that was going to happen. And so Oishi staggered his way into his small room and he collapsed onto his bed, and as he lay there trying to sleep, he felt the ship gently rocking side to side. The ship, the Lucky Dragon No. 5, was anchored relatively close to the Marshall Islands, which is a strip of islands right about halfway between Hawaii and Australia. But what's unique about the Marshall Islands is they sit over these huge ancient underwater volcanoes. Now, these volcanoes are dormant, but the captain of the Lucky Dragon No. 5 was weary enough about getting too close to these dormant volcanoes in fear they might erupt, that he intentionally kept them about 80 miles or so away from the Marshall Islands. And so eventually, Oishi did drift off to sleep in his bunk. But 5 hours later, Oishi suddenly sat up wide awake because the little room he was in was now completely flooded with this very bright yellowy light. And so Oishi, he's kind of confused. He felt like it was too early for sunrise, and he checked his watch and he saw it was only 6:45 a.m. And so yes, it was too early for sunrise. So whatever this was, it was not the sun. And then when he went to the little porthole window where all this light was coming in, he had to squint his eyes, but he looked outside and he couldn't tell where this light was really coming from or what it was, but he could clearly see it was coming from the west, and the sun rises in the east. So really, whatever this light was, it was not the sun. At the same time, the rest of Oishi's crewmates who were in this room with him, they were also starting to wake up and kind of looking around like, what's going on here? And then without even saying anything, all of them just rushed out of the room and ran upstairs to the top deck to look around and see what was going on. And when they got up there, Oishi looked out towards the west where these lights were up in the sky, and he couldn't really see a clear point of origin. It wasn't like there was an obvious thing creating these lights. It was more like the western sky was just unbelievably bright and yellow and orange, and it seemed like the light was kind of hovering over where the Marshall Islands would be. And so everyone's thinking, is it possible this is a volcano eruption? Is there something else going on here? And then as the crew is just watching in stunned silence at all these crazy lights in the sky, the lights kind of began to fade and they turned blue and purple, and then they just went away, and the entire crew was pitched back into darkness. And as everyone's just standing around having no idea what to make of these lights, the oldest crew member on board, who was 40 years old, he said the one thing that everybody kind of in the back of their mind was thinking about but didn't want to say. The oldest crew member just said, atomic bomb. Just 9 years earlier, the United States had dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan to end World War II. Now, Oishi, who was Japanese, he was 11 years old at the time this happened, and it had a profound impact on his life and his family's lives, his friends. Anybody who was alive when this happened, it changed everything. But as Oishi and the rest of his crew were kind of staring out to the west, which was all dark at this point, Oishi thought, there's no way this could have been an atomic bomb. Number one, World War II is over, so there's no reason a bomb would get dropped again. And 2, when those atomic bombs were dropped on Japan 9 years earlier, it vaporized basically everything and everyone in its path. And so for them to be this close to these huge lights, if that were an atomic bomb, wouldn't they too be vaporized? Like, they would not be able to see that and live. And so Oishi began to tell himself, okay, it probably was not a volcano eruption. It probably was not an atomic bomb. I don't know what it was, but we're okay. And while many of the other people on board the ship felt the same way Oishi did, very quickly the call came out amongst the crew to just go ahead and bring in the lines right now. We don't know what these lights were, but we need to head back to port back in Yaizu, Japan. And so quickly, Oishi and the rest of the crew got to work pulling these lines in and prepping the boat to head back to port. And then at some point after Oishi had done what he was supposed to do, he began walking his way down below to the galley to get some food. But when Oishi was about halfway, he suddenly heard this deafening explosion outside coming from the west where these lights had been, and immediately Oishi just jumped onto the ground, covering his head, thinking that was going to protect him. And as he's laying there listening to this unbelievable exploding sound, he's thinking, oh my gosh, one of those volcanoes under the Marshall Islands has indeed erupted. That's what's happening. And any minute now, a giant tsunami wave from this eruption is going to flip us over. We're going to get killed here. And so Oishi, as this massive exploding sound is going on, he jumps to his feet and he runs upstairs and he finds the majority of the crew that was still up there had jumped to the ground and they were just kind of protecting themselves. A couple braver crew members had stood up and were kind of looking out towards the west to see if they could see what was going on. But there were no lights now. It was just these crazy loud exploding sounds coming from the west. And then suddenly all the sound stopped, and Oishi and the crew at that point braced for what they believed was this inevitable tsunami wave that was going to hit them. But the weird thing is after the exploding sound stopped, everything was totally calm. In fact, Oishi glanced over the edge of the boat, and he saw the water was totally placid, more calm than normal. And after a few more minutes went by, and no massive tsunami wiped them all out, the crew was like, what's going on here? And so as Oishi and the rest of the terrified crew on deck began exchanging wild theories about what these lights and these sounds could have been, ranging from, again, the volcano, or maybe an atomic bomb, or some said maybe an asteroid hit the Earth. And as they're doing that, the ship captain called out again, hey, finish pulling in the lines. We need to get out of here right now. We don't know what that was. We don't know what's coming next. We gotta go. Now, for reference, pulling in these lines was not as simple as it sounded. It was kind of a long and complicated process, and so Oishi and the rest of the crew, they began doing their best to pull these lines in as quickly as they could. But when the sun finally rose in the east, the crew on board the Lucky Dragon number 5, as they looked out towards the west, towards the Marshall Islands, they began to notice these weird gray clouds forming over these islands. And as the crew began to talk about these strange-looking clouds, they noticed that despite the wind blowing from east to west, these clouds, these weird clouds over the islands, were actually making their way towards them. Basically, they were moving against the wind, which made no sense. And so as these clouds got closer and closer, the ship captain was screaming at Oishi and the others to hurry up, get these lines in, we gotta go, we don't want to wait for this cloud. But it just was taking so long to pull in these lines, and before long, these weird gray clouds had moved directly over them and blocked out the sun. It was like it was nighttime all over again. And as soon as these clouds were right above them, Oishi and the others, they just stopped and looked up. And suddenly it started to rain. Except not normal rain. It was like this weird milky substance, like gray milky color, and it was also hot. And so Oishi put his hands out and he cupped all this weird liquid in his hands, and nobody knew what it was. And then before long, the rain turned into sleet, still kind of gray and milky, and then the sleet turned into what looked like snow. And so Oishi and the others, they had their hands out still and they were catching these weird snowflakes, but they didn't melt in their hands. They just kind of pooled on their hand and just sat there. Now, Oishi and the others were definitely unsettled by this snow and frankly by everything that had happened that morning. They really did not understand what was going on, but there was something kind of incredible about this weird substance that was coming out of the sky. To the point where many of the fishermen on board grabbed bags and saved some of this weird mushy snow stuff to bring back home, to maybe show their families and friends, or even to give to science to see if maybe they could study it and see what it was. And so after Oishi and the rest of the crew had kind of gotten over the novelty of this weird snow coming out of the sky, they just got right back to work pulling in these lines. And the whole time, remember, they're getting dumped on by this weird stuff that's not melting and it's building up on the deck to the point where they have to stop what they're doing and shovel this stuff off the deck just to continue pulling in the lines. And for hours and hours they did that, just under this weird snowstorm. And then finally, right around noon, all the lines had been pulled in, and the ship's captain turned the wheel, and they began heading towards port. The next morning, Oishi woke up inside of his bunk on board the Lucky Dragon number 5. It would take several days to make it all the way back to port. And when Oishi woke up, he was suddenly struck with this intense nausea. And so he got up and stumbled his way into the bathroom, and just kind of out of instinct, he grabbed his toothbrush and began brushing his teeth. And as he did this, he had this weird feeling that his teeth felt like they were loose, that if he brushed too hard with his toothbrush, that he could knock his teeth clear out of his jaw. And then when Oishi spit into the sink, he saw there was all this blood. And so Oishi began to panic, and he opened up his mouth and he stared in the mirror to see if maybe he had lost some teeth. But his teeth looked okay. But again, everything felt wrong, and he felt so sick. And so Oishi, he left the bathroom and went upstairs to the top deck. And when he got up there, he saw many of the other members of the crew, and they looked terrible. Their skin was a weird gray color, and some of them had blisters all over their skin. And so to Oishi and to the other crew members, it now seemed kind of obvious that whatever was coming out of the sky, that weird milky substance and that weird snow that didn't melt, clearly it must be toxic in some way, or maybe it's led to some horrible allergic reaction. And so Oishi and the others began referring to the stuff that came out of the sky as death ash. And the fishermen who had gathered up a lot of this death ash into bags to bring back home were now too scared to even touch the bags. Like, they wanted to take the bags and dump the contents overboard, but the fear of interacting with that weird death ash was too much. And so there were these bags kind of draped all over the ship that nobody went near that contained this stuff. And over the next few days that the Lucky Dragon number 5 continued its journey towards port, Oishi and the rest of the crew members continued to get sicker and sicker. In fact, on one day, Oishi was outside unfurling one of the sails, and as he was hoisting this rope, he noticed the rope was covered in blood, and then when he looked at his hands, he realized it was because his hands were basically disintegrating as he was touching the rope, like his skin was just falling apart. And then in addition to his skin falling off, Oishi's hair began falling out in huge clumps. And he was not alone. Many of the other crew members on board the Lucky Dragon number 5 had the same things going on. It was like everybody was just totally deteriorating, and they all knew it had to be connected to whatever the heck they had heard and seen when there was that explosion and the lights and the stuff raining out of the sky. They didn't know what it was, but it could not be a coincidence. That happened, and now this was happening to them. And so finally, on March 14th, the crew of the Lucky Dragon number 5 pulled into port in Yaizu, Japan, and as they got off, they made this interesting decision to not tell anyone what happened to them. They all had this fear that, if it got out, that people knew what happened to them, that somehow they'd get in trouble. And so they all decided they would treat whatever was happening to them, but they would do it kind of secretly. And so Oishi, as soon as he left the boat, he went straight to the doctor's office, and as best as he could, he tried to kind of discreetly tell the doctor what had happened during this fishing trip. And then he showed the doctor all these lesions on his skin and the bald spots and the fact that he was so sick and that his teeth felt loose. And the doctor's like, I got no idea what's wrong with you. And so all he did was prescribe Oishi some zinc ointment to put on all of these blisters and lesions on his skin. And he told Oishi that, this should work. It should clear everything up and you should be okay. But, come back if this ointment doesn't work. A few hours later, a woman was inside of her home in the port city of Yaizu, right near where the Lucky Dragon number 5 had docked, when she heard a knock on her front door. And so she put her broom up against the wall, she walked to the front door, she opened it up, and standing right outside was this horrible-looking man who had gray skin and lesions all over him and all these bald spots, and he was smiling, and his teeth were all red, like there was blood all over his teeth. And for a second, she thought about slamming the door, but then she looked more closely and she realized it was her neighbor, Oishi. As soon as she realized this, she said, Oishi, what happened to you? And he just kind of shrugged his shoulders like he didn't have a way to explain all of this. And then he held out a small gray package and he just said, here's some extra fish that we caught on the last fishing trip I was on. I just wanted to give it to you. And the woman, who was still totally caught off guard by how terrible Oishi looked, she just turned and pointed at her kitchen table, telling Oishi to put the fish on the table. And so Oishi came inside and limped his way into the kitchen and put the package down. And then when he turned to leave, the woman stopped him and she said, Oishi, tell me what's going on here. You look horrible. You have all these bloody bandages on you. Was there a fire on the boat? Was there some sort of accident? Tell me. And so Oishi, he looked down for a second and then he looked back at her and said, I'm sorry, I can't tell you. Because again, remember, Oishi and the rest of the crew had decided they were not going to share details of what happened. And so this woman who really liked Oishi and wanted to make sure he was okay, she just said, okay, you don't got to tell me about it, but here, have a seat. We'll catch up about other things. And so Oishi, he nodded and took a seat inside the living room. And as he sat there, the woman went into the kitchen and she got a cup of water. She brought it back and she handed it to him. And Oishi, he took the cup with a trembling hand and he sat there drinking his water, just looking so terrible. And the woman, she really didn't know what to say. She did not understand at all what was happening, but she could tell, Oishi does not want to talk about it. And so to kind of break up the silence, she just began talking about stuff she had heard on the news. And the big news story that everybody was talking about was the science experiment that was done out near the Marshall Islands. And when this woman talked about a science experiment and the Marshall Islands, Oishi dropped his glass and it shattered on the ground, and he just stared at this woman with a look of absolute terror on his face. And at this point, Oishi decided he was not going to keep his story secret anymore, and so he told his neighbor what had happened out on the water, the explosions, the lights, the rain, the snow, all of it. And after he did, the woman became terrified and said, "Get out of my house, go, go, go." And so Oishi, he got up and he kind of ran out of the house, not really sure what was going on. And then the woman, after Oishi was gone, she turned and she realized the package of fish that Oishi had left was sitting inside of her kitchen. And so she screamed and she too ran out the door. Over the next few days, more and more of the fishermen from the Lucky Dragon number 5 began to talk about what had happened out on the water, and as those stories began to circulate, they began to make the news all over the world. And as this happened, fish markets all over Japan had to shut down and destroy thousands and thousands of pounds of fish in fear that it might have come from the Lucky Dragon number 5. And the reason why everybody was so scared of coming in contact with anything that had been on board the Lucky Dragon, whether it was the fish or the people, is because on March 1st, 1954, when Oishi was suddenly woken up by the bright light outside coming from the west, and then there was that loud explosion, and then the cloud and the rain and the snow, all of that was not a volcano. It was not an atomic bomb. It was not a meteorite. It was not a fire. It was that science experiment that was talked about on the news. The US military was testing a brand new weapon that is quite possibly the most lethal weapon ever made. It's called a hydrogen bomb, and for reference, hydrogen bombs are 1,000 times more powerful than atomic bombs. Now, they detonated this hydrogen bomb far away from all of civilization. However, the Lucky Dragon number 5 was just close enough to this explosion that the crew on board the ship became the first humans in history to experience something called fallout, which is when deadly radioactive particles from this explosion get thrown up into the sky from the blast, and then they rain down on you like snow. That weird material they were feeling that they called death ash, that's the fallout. It's all radioactive. And in fact, the actual material itself that was raining down on them was coral reefs. They had basically been liquefied from this hydrogen blast. They got shot up into the sky, and then that's what fell down on them. That's why it wasn't melting. It was coral reefs. And so the reason Oishi and the rest of the crew got so sick and their skin began falling off and their hair began falling off was because of their contact with this fallout, this death ash. And so once they began sharing their story of what happened out there and it began making the news, the crew of the Lucky Dragon was rounded up and sent to a special medical facility where they were quarantined, and unbelievably, only one of them died. He was the oldest crew member who had brought up that maybe the lights they had just seen was an atomic bomb. But even though the rest of the crew survived, they would spend the rest of their lives battling strange diseases and cancers, and many of them would become sterilized, and those that weren't, their children often had birth defects. As for Oishi, he gave up being a fisherman and instead became a dry cleaner, but he wound up spending the bulk of the rest of his life being an anti-bomb advocate and author until his death in 2021, when he would pass away at the age of 87.
A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. There's this one, of course, the MrBallen podcast, and there's MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, Run Fool, Redacted, and Late Nights with Nexpo. All you have to do is search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories just like this one, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Today's podcast will feature 3 horrifying stories that will make you wonder who or what may be lurking in the forest. The audio from all 3 of these stories has been pulled from our main YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called Pound Cake, and it's about a girl who takes a shortcut on the Appalachian Trail. The second story you'll hear is called The Dream, and it's about 3 hikers who attempt a rugged hike in terrible weather. And the third and final story you'll hear is called Big Footprint, and it's about a mysterious set of footprints that are found in a marsh. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please befriend the Amazon Music follow button, and when they hand you their phone for you to input your own number, Venmo yourself $1,000 and then hand their phone back. Okay, let's get into our first story called Pound Cake.
In 1989, 22-year-old Eloise Lindsay was a fresh college graduate, and she was at a crossroads in her life because even though she just earned her degree, she really didn't know what she wanted to do with her life. And because she was an experienced backpacker, she thought a good way to, kind of get her life together would be to go on a sort of retreat, go out into the woods, go out into nature, and kind of find herself. So she had planned this very detailed 43.3-mile hike along the Appalachian Trail, starting in South Carolina, where the first 7 days of the hike she would be totally on her own, and then at the 7-day mark she would meet up with a friend at a particular rendezvous point. Her friend would give her resupplies and would be her companion for the rest of the hike. When Eloise told her parents what her plans were, they were not concerned for her safety because she was an experienced backpacker. She had made trips like this before, and so they said, "Great, we'll see you when you get back." So on November 4th, Eloise sets out to begin her journey down the Appalachian Trail. And the first couple of days of her hike were great. The weather was beautiful, the scenery was amazing, and she had all this time to just kind of be by herself and look internal and think hard about what she wanted to do with her life. But on the 3rd day, when she woke up, she was sleeping inside of a tent she had camped just off the trail. She woke up and she had this intense sense of dread. She couldn't really place where it was coming from, but she knew something was wrong, and she's kind of doing inventory of her life, like, what did I forget? Is there something that I'm just not thinking about right now? But she kind of pushes it aside mentally and thinks, okay, you know what? I'm just going to pack up my campsite here and get hiking, and I'm bound to, come up with what it is that's making me feel this way. So she gets out of her tent and she begins packing up her campsite, and she's looking out, kind of scanning the tree line, not because she was looking for anything, but just because she happened to be looking out. And she could have sworn that she saw a man standing, 30, 40 feet away behind a tree. And she kind of did a double take and was staring at him. It's, it's broad daylight, it's the morning, and they're near a trail. So it isn't like unbelievable that there might be someone near her at that very moment. But she kind of did a double take and she looked at them again, and this person was gone. And she stood there for a minute, just kind of looking in the direction of where she had seen this guy, wondering, Is my mind playing tricks on me? Did I really see someone there? Why aren't they showing themselves again? If there was someone there, they clearly must have just been looking at me. Why aren't they, poking their heads out again to communicate with me in some way? We're out in the middle of nowhere. We should be talking to each other. But the guy never shows himself again. And so as she's standing there wondering what she should do, she isn't ready to yell out to this person because there's part of her that's a little bit nervous about yelling out to some stranger in the middle of the woods. But she starts to get this really intense feeling that she's being watched. And it feels an awful lot like the sense of dread she had while she was in the tent. And she's starting to wonder, are my instincts or is my sixth sense picking up that I'm being watched? Like there's some predator out there looking at me right now? And even though she has no way of knowing if that's actually true, she's alone in the middle of the woods. And even though she's experienced, she can't help but feel really vulnerable. And because this guy is just not showing himself again, she feels a little bit threatened. And so she begins to panic and she starts packing up all of her stuff as quickly as she can. And as soon as she can, she takes off down the trail away from that guy she saw in the woods. As she was walking down this trail, she couldn't help but think someone was right behind her. And she kept turning around to see if this person or whoever it was behind her, and no one was ever there. But this visceral feeling that she was being watched, that sense of dread she had, it just was not going away. And so she started walking faster and faster. Before long, she was running. And she's realizing that she's in a section of the Appalachian Trail that's very remote. She's not near civilization. She's not near her next rendezvous point. And so she's thinking to herself, I need to get off this trail. I need to get to a road. I need to get away from here as soon as I possibly can. And so her options were to continue on this trail for several miles, and it would probably take her until well into the night before she was going to reach civilization, or she could take a shortcut. Because she believed there was a road that was running parallel to her trail, but it was way down the mountain. It would require leaving the trail and basically cutting through the wilderness to get down to this road, but she was pretty confident it was right down there. And because this threat of this person or thing following her was so intense for her, she decided to leave the trail. She couldn't stand the idea of having to spend another night out in the middle of the woods with this person stalking her. And so she walks up the trail and starts running down the mountain. It wasn't long before she started to hear audible sounds coming from what she believed to be this person that was following her. And she would turn around and there'd be no one there. And then she started to walk, trying to listen as she's walking, and she would hear footsteps far away from her, and she'd turn and there'd be nobody there, but she was certain someone was following her, someone was stalking her. And the sounds that were coming out of this person, this animal, whatever it was, they sounded like, a deep male voice, but you couldn't recognize if it was a language of some kind. It just sounded more like a grunt or a yell of some kind. And so her heart rate's elevated, she's panicking, and she's walking as fast as she can, just through the middle of the wilderness, hoping she's walking towards this road. But after walking and running for miles into the middle of nowhere, she has not come to a road. It's now completely dark out, and she knows she's lost. And so she has to set up camp in the middle of nowhere, and she knows somewhere out in the middle of the woods is some person or something that is stalking me. And she's all alone. She has no way to contact anyone. She doesn't have a cell phone. It's 1989. And so she sets up her campsite and she gets in her tent. She zips it up. And she lays there hoping she doesn't hear any sounds. And sure enough, within minutes of being inside of that tent, she starts hearing those audible sounds coming from somewhere in the forest. And she hears what sounds like heavy footsteps walking around the perimeter of her campsite. All night long, she hears this. But luckily, they don't come up right to her tent. So there's some separation between her and whatever is making these sounds. And then finally, the sun comes up. She is out of that tent, packs it up, and continues running in the direction she hopes is the road. And of course, all day long, she has that sense that someone is watching her. She's hearing footsteps coming from behind her. She would turn. She doesn't see anything. She would hear that audible grunting sound, that low voice coming from somewhere behind her. But again, she would never see whoever it was or whatever it was that was making the sound. And then again, the sun is starting to set and she has not found the road. She hasn't found a trail. And she's thinking to herself, I can't even backtrack because if I turn around and start walking backwards, I'm bound to run into this very thing I'm trying to escape. And so once again, she sets up her campsite in the middle of nowhere. She gets inside, and as soon as she's laying in her tent, she starts hearing those heavy footsteps somewhere out in the woods, kind of walking around the perimeter of her campsite. She's hearing that low, audible sound that she can't quite place. And at some point she falls asleep. She gets up the next morning. She jumps out of her tent, packs it up, and starts running, hopefully in the direction that will bring her to civilization. A couple days later, when Eloise was supposed to meet her friend on the trail at the 7-day mark and they were going to finish the hike together, well, Eloise doesn't show up. But after several hours, when Eloise did not show up, her friend left the trail and contacted authorities and filed a missing person report. And the police would launch this massive search for Eloise along the stretch of the Appalachian Trail where she had said she would be. And for the next 14 days, hundreds of police and volunteers and helicopters are scouring this area, and there's no sign of Eloise. And so after 14 days from the time her friend filed the missing person report, the police had to turn the search off, and they say, look, we can't find her. Two days after the search was terminated, so 23 days after Eloise had initially set off for her trek through the Appalachian Trail, a hunter that was out in the middle of nowhere near the Appalachian Trail discovers Eloise perched up against a tree. She's totally emaciated, she's dehydrated, she's delirious, but she's alive. At first, she was terrified of the hunter because she believed the hunter was this person that had been following her. But when she realized he was there to help, she went with him. She was brought back and brought to a hospital, and she was checked out. And besides being dehydrated and, emaciated, she was okay. And she would detail in multiple interviews and in her official statement that she had been chased for the past almost 3 weeks in the middle of the woods, and she doesn't know who it was or why they were chasing her. And then interestingly, she said right before she was found, so a couple of days before this hunter finds her, this person, this thing, whatever it was that was following her, got so close to her a couple different times that she was so scared she ditched her backpack that contained all of her life-saving equipment, like her sleeping bag and her tent, and it had some food and water in there. She ditched that so she could be lighter, so she could run faster away from this thing that is chasing her in the woods. So you gotta figure, you gotta be at such a high level of fear that you're prepared to ditch the one thing you really require to survive out in the wilderness, which was her pack full of supplies. And then, after she's ditched her pack and she's run for some distance, she's got no supplies, no food, no water, she stumbles across this tree in the middle of nowhere that wedged inside the trunk is a cache of donuts and pound cake. And so she takes the donuts and pound cake, and between that and the stream water she had found, that's what kept her alive for the last few days before she was found. Eloise says she has no idea what to make of her experience, and law enforcement were baffled by it as well. Some people think Eloise had a mental break, and she effectively made this whole situation up. That she really was lost in the woods, but no one was chasing her, and she was just kind of paranoid and running around the wilderness for a couple of weeks. Other people, including park rangers that work that stretch of the Appalachian Trail, believe it's possible she could have been stalked by wild men, which are basically people that live out in the mountains that are effectively feral, that live off the land, and they've been known, according to local legend, they've been known to attack park rangers, and people that live out in that area have claimed to have seen these wild men, and they kind of match the description of what she was describing. But as of right now, there's no official explanation for what happened to her other than she got lost and was found again.
Our next story is called The Dream.
On March 7th, 1975, 21-year-old Mark Hansen, along with two of his friends from college, Ben Fish and John Chidester, arrived at a parking lot on the eastern side of the Appalachian Trail. All three of the young men were in incredible physical shape and were excited to spend their spring break challenging themselves on some of the trail's most rigorous hikes. The day before they were supposed to go, they almost canceled the trip because there was this terrible weather system that was coming over the trail. And they were thinking, it's going to be dangerous. It's not such a good idea. And then they started talking some more and they were like, well, we're already going to, challenge ourselves. It would be even more challenging to hike these really difficult trails with the inclusion of bad weather. So this is another way to, test our abilities.
And so they kind of got pumped up at the idea of hiking the Appalachian Trail in terrible weather. So the guys arrive in the parking lot, the windshield wipers are furiously working to keep the pouring rain off. They hop out and they're getting soaked by the rain. They put on their ponchos, they grab their heavy packs, and they make their way over to the trail. Their plan was to move west along the trail until they hit the Tri-Corner Shelter, where they would spend their first night. The Tri-Corner Shelter is one of the many shelters along the Appalachian Trail. They are open to the public. There's no heating or electricity, but it provides shelter from the storm. You can go in there and, get in a sleeping bag and you'll be fine. But to get to the Tri-Corner Shelter, they would need to hike 16 miles, almost completely uphill, walking right into the wind, and it's raining on them, and it's supposed to snow later on, so it's just a treacherous first day. But they take off, they start walking up this trail, and after a couple of miles, John says, you know what, guys? This is awful. I think we should probably turn around. I think we've underestimated how bad this is going to be. Let's go back to the car, and we'll do this another time. But Mark and Ben were like, oh no, we are committed. We are doing this. We are not turning around. And John's like, you know what? Suit yourself. I'm not going to do that. And he turned around and he left and he went back to the car and he would pick them up when they were done. After John turned around, Mark and Ben, they felt good. They felt tough. They're going to stick this hike out. And so they take off again and Ben's in the lead. And Ben seems to be handling the poor weather and difficult hike and heavy pack a lot better than Mark is. In fact, over the next several hours, Mark would drift farther and farther back and Ben would need to wait for him and Mark would be hunched over, really just struggling with this hike. And then at some point, Mark yells to him and says, I gotta take my pack off. I can't carry this much weight up this hill until we get to the shelter. I'm not gonna make it to the shelter. And Ben would say to him, if we don't get to the shelter for some reason, you're gonna be stranded out here in this storm without any warm clothes, without your sleeping bag, without your tent, without your food, without your water. It's way too dangerous. You have to keep your pack on. And so finally Mark is convinced and he's like, oh, all right, puts his pack back on and they continue moving. About an hour later at 7 p.m., they had reached the section of the trail where they knew they were getting close-ish to the Tri-Corner Shelter. They were certainly well beyond the halfway point. But it was dark out, the temperature had dropped significantly. At this point, Ben is basically Mark's cheerleader, kind of egging him on to keep moving, and Mark's kind of staggering along this trail, and Ben and Mark are just hoping that shelter just appears at some point here because they don't know how much farther they can go. Another hour and a half goes by. They still haven't made it to the shelter. Mark is groaning. He can barely move. It's pitch black. The rain has now completely shifted over to snow, and it is just dumping snow on them. And Ben is concerned that, somehow did we take a wrong turn, even though they were on a really well-marked trail, and he knew they hadn't. He figured they must be so close at this point. And it was around this time that Mark yells out to Ben, I'm done. I can't go any farther. And he sits down right in the middle of the trail. He's sitting down with his pack, and he's just laying there, and Ben is like, come on, we're so close. You can't sit down now. And Mark's like, I'm not moving. I can't do any more. I'm going to sleep right here. Ben knows this is a bad idea. I mean, they did have warm clothes and sleeping bags, and they probably would be just fine sleeping out in the middle of the trail, but it just seemed so unnecessarily risky when there's probably a shelter maybe a couple hundred meters away, and he would turn out to be right. And so he decides he's going to walk ahead on the trail, and he's going to see if the shelter's there, but he only went about 100 meters. He was within maybe 100 meters of the actual shelter, but he never saw it. And so after going ahead and feeling like, man, I don't want to drag Mark any farther, if there's no shelter ahead, for all we know, we took a wrong turn. And so he turns back around and he goes back near Mark, not next to him, but close enough to him that he can see him. And he sits down on the trail too. He gets his sleeping bag out, he crawls inside, and he falls asleep. That night, Ben would have this vivid, horrible nightmare where he heard Mark screaming for help, yelling for Ben to come save him as he's being dragged off the trail into the forest. And it scared him so much that Ben woke up and he looks down the trail to where Mark is, and he can see Mark's backpack is sitting right on the trail. And so he thinks, oh, Mark's still there.
And he's so tired, he's not about to get up and go check. He's like, that was just a dream. And he goes back to sleep. The next morning, when the sun comes up, Ben gets up again, and the first thing he does is he looks over at Mark, and he sees the pack, but he realizes that Mark is not there. It's just the backpack. And so Ben jumps up and he yells for Mark. He doesn't get a response. He's looking around thinking he's got to be around here, but he's not. It snowed that night, so any tracks Mark would have left to show where he went to were now covered up. And that's when it dawns on Ben that that dream he had the night before, that might have been real. And he has this sinking feeling that something horrible has happened to Mark and that he didn't save him. And so he thinks, I gotta get authorities. He grabs his bag. He leaves Mark's there because he's thinking maybe he'll come back and he'll grab it. And Ben turns and runs down the trail in the direction he hopes is towards this tri-corner shelter. And he can't believe it when literally 200 meters away, he finds the tri-corner shelter. They were that close. And inside are other hikers. He was able to get one of them to run down and get Park Services to know that they have a missing hiker on the trail. Searchers were dispatched to the area where Mark and Ben had been sleeping on the trail. The first thing they did is they went to his bag, and inside were all the things he would need to survive out in the wild. His tent, his warm clothes, his sleeping bag, his food, his water, everything. It was all left there. Over the next few days, hundreds of searchers combed the area. They had helicopters overhead, and they made no significant discovery. However, one park ranger discovered this huge cave that was not that far away from where they had been sleeping. And inside of this cave, this ranger said a large mammal had been staying recently. It was not there now. And there was all these animal bones inside the cave. So it was obviously a predator of some kind. And so there was speculation that between this cave that probably held, a bear or something like that, and Ben's dream that probably was reality of Mark being pulled off the trail screaming for help, that maybe Mark was attacked by some animal that dragged him away. On the 9th day of the search, Mark's body was found. It was located 3 miles down the hill from where he and Ben had been sleeping up on that trail. Mark was positioned up against a tree. His jacket was open, his gloves were off, and his boots were off, and they were placed right next to him. An autopsy concluded he must have died within 24 to 36 hours of leaving that trail. So there's lots of questions with this one, namely, why did Mark, in the middle of the night, get up, not tell Ben where he was going, and then leave the trail and walk 3 miles away? The trail they were on was very well worn, that even at night in a snowstorm, it would be very obvious if you were on the trail or if you were off the trail. So Mark had to have known he was leaving the trail. But even if Mark had a great reason for wanting to leave the trail, just hours earlier, he couldn't even stand. That's why they were even laying on the trail to begin with, because he couldn't go any farther. So the idea that he can just jump up in the middle of the night and navigate this really difficult terrain for 3 miles in total darkness in the snow, that doesn't make sense either. And then you have Ben's dream, where he hears Mark screaming for help, and he's yelling for Ben to come save him as he's getting dragged off the trail. There's a good chance what Ben was hearing and seeing in his dream was actually playing out just several feet away from him down the trail.
The next and final story of today's episode is called Big Footprint.
In early July of 1953, Mr. and Mrs. Huggin, along with their 3 young daughters, left their home in Winnipeg, Canada, for a 6-week summer vacation. They were headed to the girls' grandparents' summer cabin in Wade, Ontario, which is one of the more remote and wild sections of Ontario. Their cabin was right in the middle of this huge swampy forest, and they were not too far from one of the biggest lakes in Ontario called Fox Lake. The family arrived late on July 4th, so they didn't do anything when they arrived. They just hung out at the cabin. And then early the next day, all the adults decided they wanted to take the girls to Fox Lake for the day. So they began gathering all the supplies they would need while the 3 girls played outside the cabin. Now, there's no neighbors or anybody else anywhere near this cabin. And so it was totally normal to have the girls just play outside. They were not concerned about, them getting taken or something. And so the two older girls played in the front yard of the cabin, and Geraldine, the 5-year-old, was playing on the side of the cabin. So the two girls in front couldn't see Geraldine, and the adults, they were keeping their eye on all 3 girls, but they were mostly just kind of going in and out of the cabin, getting their stuff together, periodically poking their head out, but the girls were fine. At 10 a.m. that morning, the parents had finally packed up the car, and they were ready to collect the girls to head over to the lake. And so they went outside, they got the 2 girls that were out front, and they went to the side of the house, and they couldn't find Geraldine. Now, they weren't worried because where could she have gone? And so they walked around the house, they're yelling for Geraldine, and they asked the 2 girls, have you seen Geraldine? Where'd she go? And they're like, oh, we don't know. She was just over on the side of the house a minute ago. And so they can't find her outside. And so they go in the cabin thinking she must have gone in there because that's the only place she could be. But after thoroughly looking through the cabin and not finding her, they started to get a little bit more worried. At this point, the adults start talking to each other and they're saying, did anybody see Geraldine in the past couple of minutes? Has anybody seen her? And they all said, yeah, I poked my head out the window and I saw her within the past 10 minutes right on the side of the cabin. And so they all agreed within the past 10 minutes, they had seen her right outside the cabin. So they're alarmed they can't find her, but they're thinking, we're gonna find her. They go back outside and they're looking around and they're yelling for her. Now, this is such a remote section of Ontario that there's really no noise pollution and sound travels really, really well. And so when they were yelling her name, it was booming through the woods. And even if Geraldine had, sprinted for 10 minutes away from the cabin, she still easily would have been within earshot. And all she had to do was just, yell back and they would see her. But she didn't yell back and there was no sign of her anywhere. And so at this point, the family is panicking. And so they call the police. The police show up and they're looking around thinking, we're not going to be able to search this very effectively on our own. This is a huge, wild, remote section of Canada. And so they called in some professional trackers that were familiar with this area to come in and help them with their search. They also called the army in Winnipeg to send over some people to assist as well. But as soon as the search started, the skies opened up and dumped rain all over the entire area, basically washing away any footprints that they could have used to potentially find her. As the day wore on and the sun was starting to set and there was still no sign of Geraldine, her father said something to the searchers that was intended to help them find his daughter, but it was just this incredibly heartbreaking comment. And what he told them was his daughter was afraid of the dark, and that once it got dark out in the woods here, she's just going to sit down and cry. And so that will stop her from moving farther away from us, hopefully, and we should be able to find her. But they didn't. And for 3 days, they looked everywhere for her and there was no trace of her. And to make matters even worse is the weather had been really rainy and cold, not below freezing temperatures, but close, like in the 40-degree Fahrenheit range. And she just had a light shirt and shorts on. She was not prepared for the weather. On the evening of the 3rd day, they found footprints that they believed to be Geraldine's high up on this ledge in some moss overlooking Fox Lake. And the footprints indicated that this child, which was probably Geraldine, was looking out over the lake and then turned around and walked away from the ledge down into the swamp where her footprints dissipate. And so the search effort was pushed to this swamp, and they had thousands of people that are combing through this mosquito-infested bush to look for this girl, and once again, there's nothing. Then, on the 7th day of the search, they find another set of footprints in the swamp around the area where they were looking for Geraldine. But it wasn't Geraldine's footprints because they were these huge prints that if it was a human print, they would need to be an enormous human being. Or these prints belonged to some enormous animal, but they were unable to determine what animal it was. At this point, although there's not really any real evidence connecting that print to Geraldine, people are starting to suspect that whoever left this print or whatever left this print has something to do with whatever happened to Geraldine. 2 days later, so 9 days after Geraldine has gone missing, some of the professional trackers were 2.5 miles away from where that large print was found in that swamp and where Geraldine's footprints were found up on that ledge. They found a piece of her plaid shirt 2.5 miles away on the eastern shore of another lake called Long Lake. And so they pushed the search effort over to that section of Long Lake, and within 24 hours, they would find Geraldine's remains. The scene where Geraldine was found was bizarre. There was very little left of Geraldine, and from what was left, it was clear there had been significant animal predation. And so initial thoughts were, she must have been attacked by wolves, that's what killed her. But upon closer inspection, they saw that her clothing had not been torn and there was no blood on her clothes. So the animal predation had most likely occurred after she was deceased because they would have been able to pick around the clothing. Whereas if it had been a wolf attack, they would have cut right through the clothes and there would be marks that obviously, she was attacked by animals. But Geraldine's remains appeared to have been dragged out of a nearby meadow to where she was ultimately located. And so they followed the drag line into this meadow and it led them to this opening where all the grass had been matted down. And investigators said it looked like something big had been laying there. And they speculated that that might have been the area where Geraldine had been killed, and then afterwards animals had dragged her over to where she was found. And so investigators are like, well, we found that large footprint in the swamp on the 7th day in the same area where we had found Geraldine's footprints, and we thought they might be connected. And now we're finding a large, what appears to be body print in this meadow that's right near where Geraldine's remains have been found. And so probably whoever or whatever left that print in the swamp is the same one that left this print here in the meadow, and therefore is probably Geraldine's killer. But this left investigators with two theories that didn't really make any sense. The first one was, okay, these prints, the swamp print and this body print, belong to an enormous person, like a giant, who ran up to the cabin and abducted Geraldine and ran off and no one saw them or heard them. And for weeks, they've managed to totally evade capture despite being, again, an enormous person lumbering through the forest. So that seemed really unlikely. One, that this giant person even existed. And two, that if this giant person existed, how could they not get caught? They're so big running through the forest, they would be easy to spot. But if you rule out the enormous person theory, you're left with the enormous predator theory, which does make more sense on the surface because there are enormous predators that have attacked humans, so that does happen. But when they looked at her remains, they ruled out a wolf attack, and really, they ruled out animal attacks. But if this is an enormous predator, how did it kill Geraldine? The family was told that unfortunately, because there wasn't enough left of her, they weren't able to determine a cause of death. And so their best guess is she was probably mauled by wild animals, but they would even level with the family and say, honestly, we don't know what did this.
A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. This podcast, the MrBallen podcast, and also MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, Run Fool, and Redacted. Just search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts to find all of these shows. To watch hundreds more stories just like the ones you heard today, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.